far right there in the middle, and the guy just in front of him actually has been working with both of us for many, many years and is working with me right now, also as a game designer. But in 1993, I'll let you do most of the talking eventually here, but Harvey became a professional. But it was a crazy three-game year for Harvey in 1994. That's my old office at Origin, and this guy on the lower left actually works for Electronic Arts now. He's been responsible for many great games that you played. But Harvey worked on Super Wing Commander 3DO, System Shock, Ultima 8 Pagan. I'll let him talk about his roles on these games in a little while. 1995, CyberMage Darklight Awakening. Technosaurus, a game that never shipped and should have. Do not laugh. That is a game that deserved to live, but didn't, so we'll talk about why it didn't. Fireteam, a game far ahead of its time, I think, making a comeback now with some changes. 1998, Harvey agreed to join the Deus Ex team, which was critical to the success of that project for sure. This is a Nerf blasting that was traditional at Ion Storm.
On your birthday.
On your birthday,
yeah. Right.
Yeah. That is not a skirt.
It's a very bad pair of cutoff jeans. Questionable taste, I acknowledge.
Deus Ex, of course. Critical member of the
The only
team.
game you will see a woman in business attire and a skirt having a lightsaber fight with the main character.
There you go. That's the stuff of great gaming. Invisible War in 2003. And most recently, Area 51 Blacksite, Blacksite, I guess, Area 51, which we will talk about a bunch, and you'll get to see some of in a little while. He's also a speaker of some renown. He's one of the more sophisticated thinkers, I think, about games these days. He's been a character in Second Life, at least long enough to judge a contest, I guess. And an award winner. That's me doing my Superman pose behind him. But the guy who did the work is standing at the podium, so there you go. And always a hard worker. Anyway, so this is. I was telling Harvey on the way over here. This is one of my favorite quotes. I've had this in my quote file. If you don't keep a quote file, you should. It's about focusing so you don't compromise quality. Don't do a bunch of brand new tech. I think we've both learned that the hard way. At least I hope we have. Process. He's obviously a big thinker about process. Surround yourself with the right people, and make sure they all fit into the team culture you're trying to build. So those are sage words. So let's go back all the way to the beginning and talk about where you came from. So you've described some of your early years as somewhat hellish. How does that prepare you for a career in game design?
Before I answer that, can I ask, is this a game development course, or is it game design, or is it?
This is a survey of
comparative media,
game analysis, game practice. How do games make meaning? That's kind of where we are right now. Game practice. How do you make a game?
Okay.
Game business. How do you get a game to in front of an audience? And then game culture.
So can I just gauge quickly, of the people in this room, what percentage of you, by show of hands, are software engineers? So quite a half, maybe. What percentage are more visual arts oriented or audio arts oriented? What percentage are storytellers of some sort or another? Yeah. Any just business people in the room? Awesome. All right.
We can speak freely.
Yeah. So I guess the question was about personal history, which is...
Yeah, where'd you come from?
It's really interesting to me because, I've made games for 14 years now professionally, after being a fanatical game-playing kid, growing up like most people in this room probably. And every game developer I've ever met is a different beast, driven by some of the same stuff, but from a totally different background. Warren was from New York, gave me my first bagel. I had never had a bagel before. I'm a fifth-generation Texan, and I've lived all over. I lived in the Bay Area for a while. I lived in Germany for a few years. I lived in Florida for a while. I've lived in various places in the South. And I had never had a bagel, and I was working at Origin. I was a temp, and Warren brought them in. We were crunching one weekend, and he brought food in for the team. So the best thing about the industry is it puts its mark on you as much as you put your mark on it. So like, whereas my dad was a welder when I was growing up, and he went to work every day at 5 in the morning at a chemical plant down on the Gulf Coast. Super fucking hot, mosquitoes, breathing chlorine gas, whatever. All this nasty stuff at Dow Chemical that I just makes my skin crawl when I think about doing that for 12 hours a day. And I look back on the last 14 years, and I have remarkably changed. I've changed politically, intellectually, emotionally. The game industry has been very, very good for me in that sense. But in terms of where I've come from, I came from a town called Freeport, which I always say is ironically named. And it's basically you're a shrimper or a welder at a chemical plant or something to that effect. And I grew up, like a lot of people, I guess I came into the industry as a game player and a pen and paper role-playing game guy and a writer, and then struggled with the technology to get into making games. But it was all a means to an end for me to express myself, I guess. And so when I was a kid, escapism was like a huge, huge thing for me. Probably true for a lot of people in the room too. But I absorbed fiction, comic books, movies, music at a level that most of my peers thought was kind of insane. And another guy in town, Billy Kane, a producer that works in town, was another person who grew up in the town that I grew up in. And Steve Powers, I don't think Billy is in any of these pictures, but like Billy was the Texas Defender champion. So like 7-Eleven had like all these Defender machines at the local level. All over the state of Texas, kids would go in and play. And then they had a district competition, then a regional competition, then a state competition. Billy beat every kid in the state of Texas. And so our little group of kids that ran around together, I've known Billy since I was 10. Steve and I were the fanatical dungeon masters of our role-playing game groups. I was already writing. He was already drawing his own comics. Billy was the Texas Stargate Defender, a champion. In his bedroom, there was a Stargate machine and a Defender machine. And he was, not a kid with a lot of money. He had won these from the Southland Corporation. And so this trashed little room with 2 full-size arcade machines in it, which at the time, in the early 80s or late 70s, that was like a huge deal. And so I guess my point is we were consumers, rabid consumers of media of all forms. And in our case, I think it was, that environment was not a great environment. And so I constantly was looking for an outlet or a form of expression because my normal channels of expression weren't really available to me at the time. And so games was just another angle on that. And the funny thing about growing up in a small town, I think, where there's not a lot of opportunity. My mom was 15 when I was born, and my dad was 19, and he was a welder. I guess this is a piece of personal history, but my mom OD'd when I was 6. We were having lunch, and she died. And my dad eventually killed himself. And so when I talk about this environment not being one of great opportunity, I don't just mean the town, because it might be a great town. I have no idea. The lens through which I saw it, though, was pretty radically fucked up. And so games to me, the best time I had was when I was reading or writing or communicating with somebody or playing games. It was like, or watching movies, I guess. Music was equally powerful to me. And so all of these were like magical forces in the world. Like, when your world is like kind of shitty, for lack of a better word, and you put on some music, like think about the transformative power from one minute the way you're feeling to the next minute when you're really listening to something you like, or you immerse yourself in a movie. So long before I would have considered video games immersive, pen and paper games and novels and things like that were like a total window out of my existence.
Completely deviating from my carefully planned script here, one of the things that I find a little disturbing about video games in particular is that they tend to be sort of male adolescent power fantasies.
Yeah.
And was it empowering for you as a gamer, or was it escape or an outlet for creative energies that you didn't know what to do with?
I think it was both, actually. one of my good friends, Jordan Thomas, is a game designer. He worked with Warren on Thief 3, and he worked on BioShock most recently. And Jordan and I are both big horror fans. And we talk a lot about how power fantasies, specifically, as much as people malign them, it's completely, like, you immediately point to an adolescent power fantasy and talk about it as a cliche or as a nascent, like, drive that young people have. But as much as we dismiss it, it's hugely important. Fighting demons is like, it's sort of a literal manifestation of an abstract idea, right? And if you're a person who really is into horror, or where an underpowered protagonist overcomes like overwhelmingly dark or powerful forces, there's kind of like cathartic process there. So I think part of it was expression and exploration, and part of it was, killing vampires as a means of like expressing power or coming to grips at, what's the psychology term? Mastery. Like, where you have to learn that even though there are scary forces in the world, you can overcome them. And I see games as a tool for mastery as well.
Now, for me as a D&D player, I mean, it was life-changing for me. It doesn't sound like perhaps in the same way it was for you, but I loved putting on different costumes. I'm not literally, but I loved playing
Right.
different roles. I mean, role-playing was what it was all about for me. Were you trying out different roles to see who you were? I mean, was it?
I don't think so. That's interesting. I gave a talk last year. I try to do a talk if I feel like it, every year or every other year. And it's, this year I think I've been too busy. Like I said, we've been working, since June we've been working till 2 in the morning, some nights 4. Before that we weren't as busy, but we've really been crunching hard on this shooter. And I gave a talk last year, though, called the Imago Effect. I think you can find it online. And it wasn't the exact version of the talk that I wanted to give, but for years I've been saying, I want to give this talk about ideal identity, which is what the word imago means, right? Idealized self. Because I realized early on that guy very often would, when he created a character in any kind of pen and paper game, we'd be playing Spycraft or Star Wars or Marvel Superheroes or Gamma World or Boot Hill, whatever.
All the stuff I worked on.
Even Dungeons and Dragons, right? So we'd be playing RPGs, and he would tend to create characters that were very different from himself. Like, it was almost like he was distancing himself and taking on some radically different, it sounds like what you're describing. And in my case, every one of my characters, I actually, I went into therapy like 6 years ago. I think you influenced me in that direction. I see it as an incredibly healthy process.
Only to the extent that I think everybody should have to go through therapy
Right.
to be a member of the human race. Not because I was making a comment about Harvey.
Not because you drove me crazy either.
Oh, wait a
but,
minute now. We've
was
just started here tonight. Come on.
It was
Save
an
that for later.
entirely healthy process, and one of the interesting things I did early on was I made a list of all the characters I've ever created for a pen and paper RPG. And I know it sounds totally nerdy, but for the very first time, I saw patterns in them. I saw the same type of histories in the fiction coming up over and over, the same type of signature marks and things like that. And I realized that for me, it was always the same. It was always a different aspect of myself. Like, I was taking myself and like pushing it to some extreme, And so this talk that I gave on video game avatars was largely fueled, I think, by thinking about that. How some players take on a different role, some players are just playing with an idealized aspect of themselves.
Do you think that still informs your design sensibilities today? Because I realized that as a role player, I often, and as a designer, I often find myself telling kind of the same story and populating that story with the same kind of characters. I mean, people too old to be doing what they're doing are really important to me, and I don't know. That was true even when I was the youngest kid in the group, not the oldest one.
I think that's a good
dysfunctional
insight.
families.
Yeah, totally.
Every game I've worked on has been about a dysfunctional family.
I find that totally true, and I think that's an insightful point. Is the longer, you sit around and you're like, hey, what could we do with this technology, or what are we working on next round? What could we do with this intellectual property that our company owns or whatever? And you stir that pot for a while, and then you kind of come up with something that excites you, and then you start running with that, and then later you back up and look at it, and you realize it's a variation of something that you worked on, previously.
I made that me. We were talking about the story and mission structure for the game we're working on right now that I can't talk about on penalty of death. And someone, Sheldon Picotti, was the writer, lead writer on it, said, "Wait, we just recreated the Deus Ex story.
Yeah.
Hold on. That's the story we were going to do for Ninja Gold. Wait,
Yeah. Patterns.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. So, from D&D and Freeport, you went to the military. Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
What the heck?
I spent 6 years in the Air Force, and it's just kind of a random chapter in my life. Like, I wanted to marry my high school sweetheart, and I wanted to get away from the small town. I wanted to get away from my dad, and so I had gone into a recruiter's office with that guy in the lower right, because we were driving around and he was trying to figure out what to do as well. And so I sat in the office and mocked him for being there and mocked the recruiter to his face, like basically saying, "No, that's a lie, obviously," And a few weeks later, I was like, what the fuck am I going to do? Like, I'm so miserable here. And I think, of all things, I was in real estate classes or something. And I don't even know why. I can't remember why I was in those classes. It doesn't sound like me at all. And I didn't go to half the classes. I was just totally miserable. I had no idea. Oh, that's something I was going to say earlier is when you, depending on the town you grew up, it's weird how some people will have parents that talk to them about, like, well, so-and-so was a famous playwright and his wife was a musician and together they did blah, blah, blah. And if that's part of the fabric of your life as you're growing up, there are these conceptual leaps that you take where you realize that people make living expressing themselves as a musician, or they might marry somebody who is a playwright, or whatever. And if you're from a different environment where no one ever talks about that sort of thing, they're talking about pipe fitters and boilermakers, and my environment was like violent and racist and very misogynistic. It was just all this negative shit. No one ever. I didn't know. It's so funny. I read, this still blows my mind. I read comics from the time I could read forward, and I never realized that someone wrote comics for a living. And one day, someone said that they were going to the Art Institute because they wanted to be a comic book writer or whatever. And it was like, this light bulb went on where I was like, God, you could go to a city where they have one of these companies and you could actually work on comic books. It was mind-blowing. And so I can't even put into words how that leap didn't happen and then it happened. And the same leap then happened with video games. And, then I realized people make movies. And so I know friends, plenty of my friends, I mean, the best thing about the video game industry, again, is who you work with and how it puts a mark on you. I work with these guys from Carnegie Mellon, Dartmouth, MIT, a person we hired out of UT, actually. And they're all from different backgrounds. And it's so amazing, like, to talk to them and hear what forces sort of led to them thinking of themselves as an artist or a scientist or an engineer or, whatever direction you think you're headed within the game industry. But for me, it was just like, and that never, ever occurred to me. And so flailing around randomly, like taking classes that were totally wrong for me as a person, ending up in the military, which was totally wrong for me as a person, but pretty useful because I got to travel the world. I went to Saudi Arabia between the two Gulf Wars. I was in Germany for 3.5 years, which was like a very culturally broadening experience. I was part of a writers group over there that's still important to me as a person. The University of Maryland's lit club was like a huge influence over me. I had favorite professors who had written books on Thomas Pynchon or who were doctorates of Shakespearean studies. These people changed my life. It was like being around the parents, the culturally rich parents that I had always lacked. And in a way, they were very old school too. Like in the background, I was on BBSs and I played video games and things like that, and they had no idea about that. But they were a dose of the classics basically for me. And so it was, again, I think it was just trying to get away, trying to figure out what to do. I knew that I did not want to go to work in the plant. That's the one thing that I knew. And I had no idea what people did professionally. Like, there was no path in my mind from you get good grades in high school, you go to college, then you go to a postgraduate program, and then you become a legal intern, and then you become a lawyer or whatever. Like, because there were no role models, and nobody in my family had done. Nobody in my family had graduated from college. So like, there was a lot of just mystery around, like, leaving my hometown, and the best thing that happened, I think, was the professors that I was around, like Thomas More and people like that in Germany for University of Maryland. They were great, and they were meeting them was kind of like meeting you and Doug and guys like that later. So like, I track all these moments where like a bunch of revolutionary ideas happened in my head, at least revolutionary to me relative to what I was used to. And my early gaming group, I think, was one of those groups. We'd go camping every other weekend, and we played every game that existed, and we got into fiery debates about them. It's a pretty common experience for young nerds, I guess is the way our generation would put it. And then the other one would be the lit people at Maryland. Like, they just, all of a sudden I went from reading comic books to reading Faulkner, Nabokov, Alice Walker, like all these different amazing writers. And then, of course, meeting Warren and the guys who worked at LookGlass and the guys who worked at Origin. Again, it was crazy, I mean, I'm still friends with Zach Simpson, who was the tech director for us at Origin, and who I think is a molecular biologist now in the UT.
Yeah, he's a self-taught molecular biologist and video game artist, and I mean that without any sense of irony at all.
Yeah, if you look online for Shadow Goblins, he's the guy who figured out.
We might get him in here to.
Oh yeah,
wow
you totally
and amaze
should.
you.
But he's the guy that figured out how to project silhouettes on the wall and let people walk up to them, and like if there's sand falling, you can hold your hand up, and the shadow of the sand will bounce off the shadow of your hand, and all this crazy stuff. I mean, he's like one of the most mentally inventive, technical, and yet creative people that I've ever met. And so I was all of a sudden working around all these guys. It just changed my world. I mean, it must have been like going to college.
I'm pretty sure he's a high school dropout too, by the way.
He is, yeah.
So you're largely self-educated with some help from the University of Maryland.
Yeah, I ended up dropping out. I wish I could say that I stuck with it and got my degree, and you should too. But I had the chance to go back to school. I got out of the Air Force, like realizing, like, wow, what was, I mean, I had a good time. I was a satellite communications technician, and part of it was tactical, like when I went to Saudi, and part of it was fixed station, like giant dishes, And the mission of those was to survive a nuclear war, and the mission of the tactical stuff was to go set up an antenna on the roof of some building, run some cable down to an office window, make a general's phone secure so he could turn a key and talk to whoever, right? And all those were great experiences, but really it was like, okay, I enlisted for 6 years, I need to get out of here. So I moved back to Austin because one of my good friends was in Austin, and it still, I can't convey this to you, but still, it had not occurred to me that I might be able to make video games for a living, and I had friends doing it. So already I had 2 friends doing it, and when I would think about it, my self-confidence was so low that I just immediately shut down. Like that, it would not have even occurred to me. And one of them started saying, dude, you should work here. All you think about is this kind of stuff. And a game that Warren made, Underworld, was one of the most influential games ever to me. Doug Church and Warren made Underworld with some other guys, Paul Neurath, and a whole group of,
Paul's going to be here in 2 weeks, by the way. So
awesome. You should listen to that guy. But I had played Dungeon Master and I had played Underworld, and they were creeping forward. I could tell that I wouldn't have articulated it as such at the time, but I could tell that there was some sort of arc going on with games, where the possibility space of the game, where you as the player had more and more influence over what was going on. And some of my favorite games that I've worked on have been that style game, but I've also switched around a lot. So like Fireteam was the first game with voice communication between squad mates, but it was otherwise very old school. The game that I'm working on now, a guy in Germany recently called it the first commercial protest game. It's kind of anti-military industrial complex, but it's otherwise very traditional. It's a Delta Force first-person shooter, So not every game that I've worked on has had the opportunity to be, an alchemical, a chemistry set where the player could mix and match and tweak things. But Underworld was like that, and it changed my life in the way that, like, some people will say the first time I saw Casablanca or the first time I heard this piece of music, it changed my life. Underworld changed my life that way. And so the company that published Underworld and some of the guys that worked on it were in town in Austin, and I was now in Austin, and I was the world's biggest Underworld fanatic, and 2 of my friends worked at that company, and it still hadn't somehow connected that I should go work on video games. I can't even explain it other than to say it just didn't seem like a possibility. And one day my friend Steve said, we really could use a guy like you. And so that began my 6-month effort to get on with the company, where I went skydiving with Lord British, jumped out of a plane with him, had never done that before, because he took a group and Steve invited me along. I played on the softball team. I played in the pen and paper RPG sessions at night in the boardrooms. Like, the building would be, somebody would let us in and we'd play. I would come and, sit around sometimes. By the time I got hired, people said, I thought you already worked here, But 6 months of that, total failure. Didn't get a job. No matter how much I schmoozed, how many samples I handed to people. I wrote this nice letter that I gave a copy to Warren and a copy to Richard Garriott and maybe a copy to Chris Roberts. Put it on like this nice brown paper, wrote about how passionate I was, and totally never heard anything from any of them. and then there was an ad in the paper, wanted tester, video games, $7 an hour. And I got hired like that, and that's when I started working with you, and you recognized me in a way that was very useful to my whole development. My boss would come to me and go, Warren came by today, and he was asking if he could have you for his next project. And Richard Garriott came by, and he said that, are you free to move into development to do this TDA grunt work, and
Technical design assistant, by the way.
Which, and the programmers refer to as total dumbass, by the way.
Yeah, well.
There's a little bit of a rivalry. It took a while to establish game design as a discipline, in the same way it took a while to establish creative direction as a discipline. But anyway, long story short, that's how I came to Austin, and that's how I got my first start,
So that was 1993.
Yeah.
Right? And you started out in QA. I think you've already implied the answer to this, but was that a good way to get into the business?
I thought it was fantastic. All of a sudden, I had been unemployed for 6 months because I was trying to figure out what to do post Air Force, and I finished my first novel during that time, totally unpublished. I've written 3 novels now. All of them are unpublished. The most recent one I actually have some people interested in, but the first one was like a generation ship science fiction novel, utterly horrible. The second one was a relationship falling apart novel because I had just gone through a divorce. And the most recent one is kind of Southern Gothic, like guy from Silicon Valley has to go back to his shitty hometown to be at the funeral of his father, which I had also gone through. And so that 6-month period, I played a lot of games, schmoozed at the game company, slowly started wrapping my head around, what I was going to do, finished a science fiction novel, and then I got into QA, and it was like a lightning rod, because whereas most people put their heads down on a team and they go through pre-production and production and then post-production, and you look up and it's been 2 years and you've been beating your head against the same problems. It's been 3 or 5 years, some people, longer. In QA, we worked like dogs, but we worked for 2 or 3 months. Sometimes Origin would screw the pooch and we'd end up working for 6 months on the same project. You're not supposed to have a full test team on a project for a year, but we did sometimes. But my point is, we'd work for several months on a project, then we'd shift gears and we'd go into crunch again with another team. And so in rapid succession, I flew Wing Commander missions until late into the night with a small group of people. And I had pirated Wing Commander 1 and 2 a couple of years before that. And so it was kind of a weird thing where I knew all the missions already. And we were playing on a 3DO, which was a console that you may not remember, because it died because they wanted $700 each for it. I still don't understand how companies make those same mistakes.
It was the right idea, the wrong time, at the wrong price point.
Wrong price point, yeah. So, we flew Wing Commander missions, and then I heard that there was this game coming into test. I saw it over somebody's shoulder called System Shock. And I was like, wow, that looks like my kind of thing, And I was happy to have the Wing Commander gig for a couple of months, whatever it was. But this is the transformative experience. This changed my life. And so all of a sudden I'm in a room full of people that, could take it or leave it. What are you going to put me on next? And I was a fanatical cyberpunk science fiction fan who was into these immersive worlds where you explored the world and recombined the elements to play it your way. It would be like, a group of people who, like I'm atheist or agnostic, I guess, religiously, but like some of my very close friends are deeply religious. So it would be like a group of people who are deeply religious or who are deeply agnostic or atheist with one guy in the room who is a zealot, and the Pope comes into the room. And like the other people are like, hey, look, it's the Pope. Wow, weird. And that one guy is just like, Your Holiness, oh my God. And so looking at System Shock, the experience, not any of the people, but the game itself was like, oh, Your Holiness, I recognize you. And it was this powerful experience. And this probably all happened behind the scenes where the executives, are looking at a chart like how many people we get. But under that, there's this emotional layer going on where I was like, I went to my boss and I said, you have to let me work on this game. I said, I'm not leaving your office until you say yes, and here's why. I said, I've read all these books that this is based on. I just finished Snow Crash. I read Neuromancer a couple of years ago. Came out the year I graduated high school. I said, I play all the games that this is based on. I know Underworld like the back of my hand. And I went on and on and on and on. And she was like, okay, we have a slot. We'll put you on the team. And so that began a 10-month experience working with Warren and Doug Church and the guys from LookGlass. The last couple of months of the project, Doug was sharing my cubicle. And Doug is another guy like Zach Simpson who's like part artist, part technical genius. And it was, again, a transformative experience. Because I felt like Warren was more like me in one sense, that film and books, and pen and paper RPGs were very important to you and had transformed your life in some way. And Doug was a child of the video game age, the way I felt like I was. And so I really grew a lot in that 10 months, And by the end, I was lead tester, and, Warren was talking about recruiting me into his producer group, and we worked on CyberMage after that. So that was a great start. That whole QA thing was fantastic.
Well, you played a lot of roles. You've been a tester, you've been a lead tester, you've been an associate producer, you've been a project director, creative director. Why don't we run through the games and you can talk about your roles on each of them and how it's changed and how the industry's changed during that time.
Yeah, because there's a lot of like quest for legitimacy in there that I think everybody in this room is going to struggle with in some sense or another.
Absolutely. But I mean, you're kind of a poster child for everything that's possible in the video game business. I mean, you started out, Harvey really exemplifies what you can do regardless of the position you start in. I mean, I know a lot of people who go, oh, QA, I wouldn't do that. No, I'm a programmer, or I'm a whatever.
And actually, that was my attitude at first. Like when I first started going around, and trying to get the job at Origin, I was like, I am a writer. I want to be a game designer. I would never sully my hands by testing games. And it turned out to be the best thing ever. As soon as I put my ego aside, and I realized, only in retrospect, I was not smart enough to realize this in advance, but that a strong QA guy works with the lead programmer, the lead artist, the musician, the producer, the writer, the translators, like the guy printing the discs. Like at the time at Origin, the lead QA guy, by the end of the project, everybody had counted on me for something at some point or another. Yeah.
Well, and you got to interact with everybody on the team.
To see a little piece of their role.
And contribute to making their jobs and their lives easier. And you really took advantage of that in a very positive, productive way. And you, like I think the best QA guys, showed some of your design sensibilities too. I mean, in a way that if you come in as a junior designer, you might get to build a map.
Or you might get to tag objects all day. Like, hey, we have 4,000 objects. We need you to tag them with the correct string to set up their surface material detection so that when an object hits them, it plays the right audio cue or whatever.
And that's a ton of fun.
But it's not really a growing experience.
No, but what you can do from QA, I'm really not proselytizing here and saying you should all get jobs as testers, by the way, but it's a great opportunity to to help make the game better. I mean, you're writing up not just bugs, but suggestions and talking to the people who are actually making the game day to day and helping them, showing them that you know how to make their game better. And then in that way it becomes your game.
Origin was amazing too because, like, we had people in our QA department who, like, Mark Vitek went on to be the lead designer of the Crusader series, and now he's like a local indie film guy. Starlong was in our QA department as another lead tester with me, and he was the guy for the first MMO. He made Ultima Online and was more responsible for that game getting done, I think, than just about anybody I know. It was such a great opportunity at the time. I don't know that QA is still the answer in that same way, but at the time it was phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the big differences I think is that Origin was at the time you started it was a publisher.
Yeah.
And EA took us over right around that time, but as a publisher we had to build a large sustainable QA department, and now it's like I'm probably going to have half a dozen full-time QA guys, and then I'll supplement with contractors. So
that's
it's
exactly
hard to have the same kind
what
of
we're doing for Blacksite. We have, like, I don't even know, our QA guys would get mad if I use the wrong number, but let's say it's 10 guys locally that are doing a good job of specialized QA, like checking TRC compliance with Sony or Microsoft, But then we have this group in India that, like, writes up really good bugs. We send them a new version of the game, they pound on it, they find all the places where you can fall out of the map, they find all the crashers, they are software analysis people. They go through a repeated process. Okay, I can repeat this crash by doing these 5 steps over and over. Okay, I've eliminated one of the steps, I can do it in 4. Oh, it's this. It's using a grenade against this kind of physics hull. It's like, whoa, that's a great bug. That'll help the engineer fix it like that. So yeah, it's a totally different world. And the other key catalyst, I guess, from Origin at the time was the industry was right on the verge of transitioning from we don't need designers to we need game designers. The industry's gone through this interesting change where back in the day, one programmer writing code would make a game. And then he finally realized, wow, if I let that guy who specializes in art do the art, it will be better. And then they realized, wow, if we let this musician who specializes in music do it, it will be better than the music I can make. And it's just grown from there, right? And so we have a guy on our team whose whole job is to tune numbers around difficulty. And so he goes in and he changes the damage of a weapon or how many hit points a particular creature has. He sets all that stuff up. But he also does, like, how long does it take to do a 360 with the controller stick if you just start rotating in place? Studies have shown that good first-person shooters on the console takes about 1.8 seconds to do a 360. And some people ship games with 2.5 seconds. Some ship a game with, like, 1 second. And both of those feel wildly wrong to the average player. So they're just some good best practices things that he's doing now too, And then at the last part of the project, he goes into a room-by-room basis. And he goes, okay, we don't want to mess with our global settings too much because that would make the game feel inconsistent and arbitrary. However, if we go into this room and we soften it a little bit, the players are finding it too hard. So he puts a damage scaler over the room, and the player takes 10% less damage there. Goes into a bridge fight and says the player's going to take 10% more here. It's going to be one of the epic battles in the game. But who foresaw that the game industry would explode like this and would have all these specialist roles?
So where did that person come from? Is that a designer? Is that a programmer? Who is that?
I think
who should it be anyway?
I think in his case, I think he's been in the industry 8 years, so it was probably different when he started than now. Where it would be now is I've hired probably more people. I think more people in the game industry. I've probably hired more people out of college than any other game studio in town so far. For this game, we needed to ramp up really rapidly for the 2 games we're working on. And so I convinced my boss to let me hire all these guys. And I said, hey, this thing that has happened with me by accident, me and Starlong and those other guys in QA, and then years later, I started recruiting people out of the mod community, the first person and perspective mod and RPG mod community. And then 1 out of 10 of them would just really soak it up like a sponge and take off. I'm going to try to codify that process. I'm going to go talk at schools like Full Sail or Carnegie Mellon, and I am going to give a lecture and talk to the students. And when I'm recruiting, which, like at the time we were recruiting heavily, I will talk to the students and I will try to find the guy who reminds me of this type of person, and then I will, and so what we did was we started talking to the C++ programmers at Full Sail and Carnegie Mellon, and then identifying the ones that also had this artistic streak or this frenetic communication streak or just seemed like they had it together. We hired Juliana Budding out of UT. We hired Rusty Simpsrod out of Full Sail. We hired Seth Shane out of Carnegie Mellon. We brought in all these guys who are like brand new to the industry. And nowadays, I think they would come from that environment. And what we did with one of them, Josh Hamrick, is we said, you're going to share an office with Matt, who's a 9-year veteran who is responsible for tuning this game. And he is going to farm a bunch of tasks out to you. You're going to learn the tool set that he uses. And so a couple of months later, Matt is so busy, he's doing all this stuff, and he would just turn to Josh and go, hey, we found this and this and this in the blind test. Can you change the max clip size for the sniper rifle from 5 to 4? And Josh would be like, why? That's not realistic. And Matt's like, well, because it's very powerful right now, and we don't want to nerf the damage it does because the expectation on the user is that a headshot kills somebody. However, we need to nerf it in terms of we need to reduce the power in some way. So, 2 months later, Josh has learned 80% of what Matt knows about tuning this game. And the other 20% is going to come much slower over years. And there's another track altogether that Matt has that's from seeing multiple projects at different points that he will not learn, Josh will not learn until he sees multiple projects from different points. And there's another track of maturity that Josh won't get until he matures, right? But in terms of game tuning, like in a few months, he's soaked up all the stuff. So I think Matt probably came from QA, but his protege now came from, he was a C++ programmer, a designer, and a producer from Full Sail.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Almost hate to go back to this now. You already talked about Super Wing Commander some. You were a tester on that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just finding bugs, learning how to enter bugs in whatever bug database we were using.
Yeah, there's so many pieces of knowledge there, like, what is a bug? Like at the time I had no idea. And it was like somebody, Brian Wakas or somebody like that, said, no, here's your clipboard. You're on a folding table in the back of the room. You're $7 an hour. We could cancel your contract like that, and you don't even get a computer, and we want you to sit here for 12 hours a day and write bugs. And the first couple of bugs I wrote were terrible, and it was like, what you're really trying to do is break the game and get a repeatable path to breaking it so that an engineer whose time is way more valuable than yours can go fix the problem. And it was pretty much put to me like that, and I figured it out and then started like creatively trying to break the game, because when you play games over and over for hours and you're not doing it for fun, you're doing it for money, it gets really boring. And so I had literally had calluses on my thumbs and stuff. But yeah, that's all we did with Wing Commander was.
Okay. And then System Shock again. Some of my fondest memories of that project are 3 in the morning.
Yeah.
Sitting there with a Forte VFX 1 on your head, looking around and stuff, and talking about I can't believe the guys at LookGlass actually added a moving star field and moving security cameras the day before we go beta. How could they do that?
Yeah.
And loving them for doing it. But
yeah.
Those were some great times.
Yeah, it was one of the first games of this type with any kind of VR, virtual reality. So 2 different companies were vying for our business, and they had sent us prototypes. One was called the CyberMax, and we called it the Cyber Brick, because it was the shape and size and almost the weight of a brick. And there was a plastic strap with a crank on the back. And so you'd put it down and then like screw it, and it felt terrible. And it had all this optics and all this glass in it. It heated up. But it had 2 little projectors in it, and you could it detected the motion. I mean, it was like a $10,000 prototype. One day it caught fire. One of my testers was wearing it, and I smelled something. And I turned around, and he's got his back to me, and he's doing this. You know, he's got one hand on the most horrid controller ever devised. The what was it called?
Oh God, I remember what the.
It was like a mouse on a pillar that you had to hold your hand on like that, and it had all these degrees of freedom, but it was really stiff. And so a game that should have been a pleasant, immersive experience if you had just had your keyboard and mouse turned into literally like torture. Like, you know, all the little muscles in his arm, by the end of the day, he would leave like this, you know. But he was doing the whole, like, you know, looking around, like trying to lean around corners because he's got this, like, you know, it's sensing his motion. And I see this wisp of smoke, and I was like, John, it's on fire! And he just throws it into the wall. And so, like, it just, like, sails across the wall like a fastball and makes this sickening, like, you know, we had been told, like, we were the peons of the company, and we had been told, like, don't break this, you know. You break it, you buy it, it's 10 grand, you make $7 an hour. You do the math, you know. And so it just goes and falls and just sits there smoking. And so, you know, we got out of it because we said it caught on fire, which it did, you know, but we had that one and another one. I can't remember what the other one was called. Oh, yeah, Forte
VFX1.
Yeah.
I still have a CyberBrick. I'll bring that in and show it to you. We will not be plugging it in, however.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
No. Trust me, you don't even want to put it on your head.
The technology wasn't ready for prime time.
Yeah, imagine you're 3/4 blind.
Yeah.
And you're not wearing your glasses, and you're trying to play a game, okay? It just was
You know what's chilling to me now is the thought, though, that I don't know if you've seen the new iPod Nano with video. Like, it's pretty stunning.
We
like,
could totally do it now.
They're the size of the Nanos that clip on, but they have a video screen that is just like, I think it drops a bunch of pixels, but it makes up for it with this contrast algorithm that's like really, really good. And so it's like amazing. And I can just imagine, like, the modern version of that would probably be a little heavier than a pair of sunglasses, you know.
I'm totally ready for VR headsets to come back. I mean, that was, as crazy as it was, playing System Shock and Wings of Glory, another game that I produced at that time, World War I flight sim, where you're actually seeing the world as if you were in the world with no distractions, I mean, it was an amazing experience. It really was.
But anyway, on System Shock, it was like, again, tester, but then later the lead tester, so duties changed. But the best thing about it was the accessibility of the team. Like, Warren would sit down and have creative conversations with me, which
I had more fun doing that than most of what I did for a living at that point.
Just, you know, going back and forth about the game and what we could do, and should we try to do dual wielding pistols, and, you know, what allusions from various science fiction movies or books should we try to work in, you know. And the team was very accessible. A bunch of brilliant people, Austin Grossman and Doug Church and all those guys, like Dorian Hart, you know, some of the guys that worked on BioShock recently. Like, there were just a bunch of really good guys on that project that I learned a tremendous amount from.
I think we all did.
One quick anecdote, I almost went to work for LookGlass, and instead I decided to stay and work on Technosaurus. And it was the difference between going to work on the games with my mentors that I thought would be the kind of game I loved versus staying and doing a different type of game, but getting a lead position. And I made the ambition choice there. And I don't know if it was the right choice or the wrong choice, you know. I would have been part of, like, a small group of guys making immersive sims on one hand. On the other hand, I got to be a producer for a while, and for a couple of years, you know, a year and a half, and it was really phenomenal experience. Right call. But a funny anecdote, like, I went to the interview in Boston to work with LookGlass, and I was so thrilled. I was like the kid who loves baseball getting to go to the pro game for the first time, right? And, you know, seeing Doug's office for the first time, which was a wreck. And it was just filled with trash and old games that he hadn't opened and bicycle parts and shit like that.
Paychecks he hadn't cashed for 5 years also.
He barely had room to sit down, you know. And it was a great experience. And I ended up turning the job down on the project called Terra Nova, which I still thought came out as a really ahead of its time game. But great moment in my life, like, in the way that, like, only you can really appreciate the great moments of your life. They're not the big epic moments. Sometimes they're the little moments. So we went to lunch. They picked me up from the hotel. We went to lunch. I'm with Paul Neurath, who you're going to meet, I think, the lead programmer, an MIT grad from the Terra Nova team, a couple of other people like that. These guys are super smart, and they've all been making games for 5 or 10 years, you know. And they've made some of the games that I consider to this day some of the best games of all time. And we're walking down the hall in their building through the lobby, back into their office suite. There's a door to their offices, LookGlass Technologies. There's a key code on it. And we're about to walk in. They're leading me in. And one of them stops, Art Min, who a guy I still work with, who's he's really smart and really creative and really fun, but he's a little bit challenging. He likes to challenge the people around him. And so he stopped everybody. He was like, wait. It's like, Harvey, what's the code? And I just looked at the keypad.
Does anybody know? Can anybody answer that question? Oh, God.
I just looked at the keypad, and I just went 0451, and the door opened. And Art patted me on the back, and he was like, good. And I walked in, and it was like that moment where you're so under pressure and so on the spot. And the first keypad and System Shock that let you out of the first safe area, right? So you had, as a player, it's more or less a training tool. Before you can leave this area, you have to demonstrate that you can use keypads. It was an allusion to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, so it was a 0451. And there's a code, the first code in BioShock recently is 451, 0451, as an allusion to the original System Shock. So, it wasn't about being a genius, it was just about connecting the context,
You got the job right there, by the way.
Yeah, I had the offer right there.
Yeah. So from there, Ultima 8. Now you were lead tester on that, but that was your first real design challenge, right?
That's such an interesting story to me because the way that actually happened is I was not on that test team really. One of my good friends, Star Long, was. But I was super hardcore into computer RPGs at the time. And when Ultima 8 shipped, I was just like, I can't believe we're shipping this game. It's so flawed. And the team was like, I know, we're being forced to ship it, yada, yada, yada. The development team was very hostile to input, I thought. They might deny that now. If you brought them in next week to talk to them, maybe they're right, I don't know. But my perspective at the time was they were not about the end user. They were about their own whims. There were some really talented people on the team that were, by the way. But some of the designers were very combative about the whole player experience. Now we consider that product focus. We as designers are much less important than the end user, right? We are doing this for their experience, not to show how clever we are. But at the time, that was kind of a novel idea. And again, not that there weren't great people on that team, because there were great designers and programmers and artists on that team. It was way ahead of its time in some ways. But in terms of usability, in terms of user interface, and give you an example. It was an isometric view game, so the camera was fixed, and you're walking along near this 2D sprite of the avatar, and there are trees, and you can't see behind the trees. You can never rotate the camera, it's fixed. And so, but you could walk behind some of the trees. So one of the designers hid explosive mushrooms behind one of the trees. And the load times in the game were egregious. They were terrible. And walking behind one of the trees, I heard a boom, and my guy died, right? And so I went down the hall, and I was like, you hid an explosive mushroom behind a tree? That is no fun. I died, I had to reload, it took 3 minutes, I lost my save game, had to replay through 30 minutes of your content because you think it's cute to hide a death trap behind a tree. I'm the player. I want to look out into the environment and see a problem and see the tools that I have and solve the problem creatively. That's really my goal as the player. And some games are highly constrained and some are very open. And they have trade-offs. Highly constrained is not always bad. You always know where to go in a highly constrained game. So the emotional intensity of other forms of drama can be ratcheted up. But, I'm the kind of that likes the less linear experience, but I'm probably in the minority because of that. But in any case, that's what I want. I want to be able to look into the environment, strategically figure out some things according to some consistent rules and apply that. And you totally screwed me here. There is such a thing as information economy where you deliberately withhold some information to make the player feel underpowered or vulnerable. Horror movies do that all the time. Jodie Foster at the end of Silence of the Lambs is in a dark room. Buffalo Bill has night vision goggles on. She has no information. The information economy is being manipulated for fear effect there. Because you empathize with another human being, you feel afraid. She shoots out the boards, now she can see. He's blinded, she's reversed the information economy, and she kills him. So there is a moment to do that as a game designer, but this was not the moment, and this was not a fair way to do it. And I think the response I got from the designer was, go back to your cubicle. And it was something like, I don't play games for a living, I make games for a living. It was just really, really arrogant. And so as a lot of things in my career have happened based on anger, I went and I wrote, here are the 100 things wrong with Ultima 8. And I sent it through email to the president of the company, Richard Garriott, Warren Spector. I sent it to my boss, Kay. And the development team freaked out. It like set their hair on fire. Who is this guy? And it was simple stuff. It was like, when you touch water in the game, you die. Like, why not just let me not touch water? Like, why not just put a barrier up so that I can't go into the water? Like, I'm in armor, so I can't swim. Fine. That's a constraint that I will accept. But if I accidentally am trying to walk along the edge of a bank and I touch water and I die and have to reload, that's not fun. You know, so regardless of your mileage in that situation, you might have done it differently as a game designer or whatever. I wrote up 100 things. And I went to Richard and I said, Richard, I can't believe you just shipped this game. As a guy who loves this kind of game, here's 100 things you ought to fix. To my total surprise, instead of fighting with me about it or reacting, I guess the way I expected my dad to react or something, you know, like instead of like slapping me down or yelling at me or whatever, Richard was like, you're right. Why don't you fix those things? And I was like, whoa, what do you mean? He was like, I'll give you a programmer, I'll give you a designer, I'll give you a few months. And what I didn't know, Richard was like thinking 3 steps ahead, was that their plan was to release the floppy disk version and then the CD version after that. And we had just done that on System Shock. Mm-hmm. We released this floppy version, which was pretty mediocre, I think.
Oh, no, totally.
And then we released the CD version, which was one of the best games ever, I thought. Like, you know, it wasn't my game, it was his game and the team's game, but it was one of the best games ever. And the difference between the floppy and the CD was the CD version had voice. All the monsters talked to you. The audio environment was super rich. It had several more months of optimizations and bug fixing and frame rate increase and interface smoothing out. It was just a much better game. And so I sat down with a couple of designers and a programmer, and I started getting them to fix the things. And we did not get through the list of 100. We got through like 65 or something like that. But we hit the most high priority first, right? And the game got re-reviewed. The CD came out, and it got re-reviewed by, at the time, Scorpia was the game reviewer for RPGs, and she rated it much higher than the original game when it came out. And I felt this great sense of satisfaction, but I also still struggled for legitimacy, because what was I? Was I a designer? No, I hadn't made the original game. Was I, you know, I hadn't written the plot. I wasn't the programmer who fixed it. I wasn't technically the producer, although now in retrospect, what I was really doing at the time was I was driving like a producer, you know, but
and your efforts were observed.
Yeah, and right after that,
and then I ruined your life.
I think Warren, having worked with me on System Shock and then seeing what I was doing with the Ultima 8 team, said, wow, this guy's kind of got a tenacious streak or something. Maybe he should be a producer.
And so you joined my producer group, where I was working on a game called CyberMage with David W. Bradley, one of the sort of old school stars of the video game development world.
Well, this was another interesting case where, in retrospect, I'm not sure what I liked about Crusaders of
Might and Magic.
Was it?
But no, he was the wizardry guy.
Yeah, Wizardry 7,
yeah. Crusaders
of the Dark Savant, or something like
yeah,
that was the name of it. Yeah,
that's right.
But I don't know what it was I liked about it, but there was a weird vibe to it. It's almost impossible for me to articulate. It had good art, and it was an RPG, sure, good RPG mechanics, but it had like it was almost punitive, like how hard it was to play. And it was a combination of science fiction and fantasy that was kind of weird. But there was something beyond that. There was a weird vibe to the world that when you were exploring this world, it felt a little surreal. And I don't think that was deliberate on his part. But I love that. And so when this opportunity came up, I was like, hell yeah, that guy, I played, Wizardry 7. That sounds great. And then it was basically 10 months of hell.
Yeah, yes, it was. Now, moving right along. Actually, the funny thing is, I've thought back. This was a very difficult project.
Very difficult.
Very difficult for reasons that we should probably not talk about too much. But in retrospect, there was more going on in this game. Maybe this is my imagination.
Oh,
maybe
no, you're right.
I'm just
Yeah, you're totally right.
hugely rationalizing as a person.
I mean, it's very possible in the game industry to make a bad game and look back on it and realize you did something innovative.
Yeah.
Like, I think Fireteam was a very good game. Like, it played as a video game very well. It was fun. There were 3 classes, 4 multiplayer modes. It was multiplayer only. There was a trainer that I wrote the script code for. It had good audio that I had plugged in. You know, I did a lot of stuff besides building maps and setting up game rules and balancing weapons on that project. I was like one of 6 people on the team, so it was like kind of old school where you did a little of everything. But I think it was a good video game. But I've worked on other games that I think are like kind of mediocre, but Warren pushed and pushed in that game to do the hand.
That's the thing.
Yeah, and it was like the hand in the game, instead of just walking up and highlighting something and clicking a button, we experimented with, you played the game like with a mouse generally and a joystick, and so whenever you'd go to interact with something, you literally like, your motion would literally move the hand around sort of in 2D space, and then you could click, you know, and it was, Trespasser tried the same thing later, more physically modeled. But one way or the other, whether the game overall was a failure or a success, it was super interesting in that way.
It really was. And the interesting thing, the UI is the thing I look back on in this game and think, hey, that was pretty interesting. We did some interesting stuff on that. And the setting, for all its weirdness, it had a lot of the same quirkiness. Well, there's the hand.
He's reaching for the icon.
Yeah, and then using it in the shot right above. But it had conversations that you could ignore if you wanted. You could walk away from them if you just wanted an action experience. That's kind of an interesting idea. And the world was sort of suffused with information. It would bombard you with like little video clips that sort of talked about what you were doing in the game, and it was all faked. But there were just a couple of things in here that when I think back, now that all the pain of development is behind us, we're cooler than I gave it credit for, I think.
If I had to point to one major failure, though, in the process, this was the end of the era where one guy could sit in his room and do a game, and if you didn't like it, he could tell you to go screw yourself. Like, I like it. And the beginning of the era where, A, you had to be able to manage a large team of moving parts in order to make a game successfully, and B, it was very much more about best practices and the user experience. Because if you're the only game in town, it's like a monopoly. If you're the only cable provider in town, you can treat your customers pretty crappy. But as soon as a new cable provider comes along who says, I'm going to make your experience vastly better, you're out of business if you don't react. And so, shooters for a while had these terrible, terrible interfaces, and Doom came along, and I guess Wolfenstein before that, and it was super simple. And System Shock, for as brilliant as I thought it was, it had a horrible interface. And many games much later, including our own Deus Ex, let the player interact to a greater degree with a simpler interface. And I think that was the lesson that those two lessons about one man versus a team, and responding to user feedback, like, were the two big things that we learned there, I think.
So Technosaur, terrific concept. It was your first experience, I think, building a team from scratch.
One of the best learning
Terrific
experiences
team.
of my life.
Every one of those guys is now a playa in the industry.
Yeah, it was a great experience.
What the heck happened? I left. I feel like I left you in the lurch on this one. Oh. But what happened to Technosaur?
What happened was...
what was it, actually?
Behind the scenes, I had played a game called Dune 2. I don't know if you're familiar. How many people are familiar with Dune 2? Yeah, okay. So it was a really old school game. It was not actually the first RTS, I don't think, but it was the first on the PC. And I was blown away by Dune 2. I didn't like the Dune fiction. I didn't read the Frank Herbert novels, but you could do everything with a single left click, and yet you could do more in the game than you could in most games. So it was instantly, in my mind, I guess it took a while to actually articulate this, it was a lesson that complexity and depth are not the same thing. You want low complexity, high depth, right? And you could do everything with a single left click, and Dune had this amazing vibe. And all your guys gave you instant feedback with voice, and it was if you don't know Dune 2, it was an RTS. It was like Command and Conquer or World in Conflict or Warcraft, right? And it was one of the first of its kind. And I immediately wanted to do something just like that. And I came up, and Warren was so open to just like talk about new ideas. And so I said, well, what if the ecological disasters of Earth's future, like what if the Earth was at the present was invaded by people from Earth's own future? So like the people of the 20th century with tanks and military units were invaded by the few survivors who are crazy, like post-apocalypse religious nuts who have somehow managed to figure out time travel and have cybernetically modified dinosaurs because they can pop around in time, right? Came back and invaded it because the Earth of the 20th century wasn't ecologically ruined yet. And at the time, that's the kind of idea that got people excited. And
I like dinosaurs. What can I say?
But the brilliant part was I could describe it in a way that excited people. And so I would say, imagine it's dark and a guard is on duty and it's raining. And a massive Tyrannosaurus Rex is creeping through the woods. And it's like got a rocket launcher on the side of its head, and it's got night vision built into its eyes. And you hear trees breaking, and then the guard rings an alarm, the rain starts to fall, a tank rolls out, and they're firing rockets across this open field. And so I would tell these little vignettes like that about here's what the gameplay is going to be like in the story. And it really lit a lot of people up. So make a long story short, I had 6 months behind the scenes meeting at 24-hour restaurants with the people that were going to eventually be the team. And then 1 year of development where we got pretty far. Like we were one of the first Windows games that Origin was working on. But one of the truisms of games is it's very easy to put a demo together and very hard to ship a game. They're worlds apart, And I guess the way people often, it's almost like what was that coach's name? Yogi, what's his name? But it's almost like one of those math jokes. But they say that the first 80%, the last 20% of a game takes you like 80% of the effort or something, right? I mean, it's like pretty easy to get something up on screen that looks pretty good and convinces people that you're working on a game. And then it's very hard to take that to the end for some reason. And so we got a good-looking demo up and running, and it demonstrated the concept, and it was graphically pretty, and it had one flaw. We had decided that we were going to innovate because at this point, Dune 2 and Warcraft 1 had come out, and Command & Conquer was coming. And there was about to be a giant wave of RTSs, and if we had executed on this game with the graphical quality that we had and the innovative depth of features, I think we would have made a lot of money and made a lot of gamers happy, right? But there was one flaw in it. We wanted to be able to have lots of animations for our dinosaurs and our tanks and stuff. And we wanted the user to be able to zoom all the way in and all the way out. So you could look at the map from 5,000 feet all the way down to 20 feet. And the way we did that was, the only way we could afford that was if we did the dinosaurs from purely top down so that we could use a sprite rotational algorithm to put them any compass degree. It could be heading this way or heading this way. They weren't separate animations. Most of the RTSs did a 3/4 angle. So the 2D piece of art for the guy facing this way was literally a different piece of art and so it upped the memory requirements. And so we went with this purely top-down model, and it allowed us to do some things, scale up, scale down, have lots more animations, etc. And we went to review with EA, and we tried to explain that, and of course at the time I wasn't really prepped for that part of the job. It was like throwing a lamb to the wolves. I went to this EA review with my lead programmer, and Don Matrick was the executive over the meeting. And a few months earlier, he had looked at the game, and he, in that EA way, Bing Gordon came in, who was like creative guy, head of marketing, and he said, "You ought to call this game T-Rex, like Rex, W-R-E-C-K-S, like a car wreck, T-Rex." And we were like, "Whoa, that doesn't sound very good to us, We're totally into this fiction, and we like Technosaur, and because we're nerds." He was probably right, by the way, but. Don Matrick was the other guy who looked at it, and he was like, "This top-down angle is not going to work. Go to 3/4 angle like all the other games, and you can see the units better. You can see the dinosaur. It doesn't look like a dinosaur from top down. And I was so fucking hard-headed, I totally blew him off. I tried to talk my way out of it. Yeah, we'll talk to you in 3 months, blah, blah, blah. We flew out for the presentation. By this point, we'd started to have problems with the purely top-down angle. Smart people, like Warren, had told us, I'm not sure about that top-down angle. A marketing woman I couldn't stand.
Don't name her.
I won't. Embodied everything bad about marketing that did not understand games at the time. Now we have marketing people who get games. They're much better. But anyway, she came into one of these demos I was giving, and she was looking at this Triceratops. It was raining, these grassy fields. There's this Triceratops. It has like you could go into the user interface and like pick your loadout to whatever dinosaur. If you wanted to outfit it for stealth, you go with silencer-equipped weapons and night vision, heavy armor, rockets, whatever. So this Triceratops was there. And she said, literally, is that a violin in the field? And the whole demo came to a stop, and everybody looked around, and I felt like such an idiot. Like, if from 5 feet away from the monitor, you can't even tell what it is. And so we went out to California to do our presentation to EA, and they killed the project because I hadn't listened. And I'm pretty sure that our maps wouldn't have to change, but if we had just changed the angle to 3/4 angle, we would have kept progressing within the EA system. But I didn't know what I was doing yet, and I thought I knew everything, and I was too hard-headed, and so the project got killed. I watched, of the 13-man team, they fired all of us but 3. They kept the 3 people that they wanted the most, and I watched 10 of my friends carry boxes with the HR people out the front door, and it was a mind-blowing experience, and I felt so bad. All those people generally ended up somewhere better after that, I think, but it was a huge learning experience.
The interesting thing is knowing what lesson to take away from that, because in that case, the people who gave you that advice were right, but sometimes you have to stick to your guns.
Oh, totally.
Making that judgment call is what separates successful people in this business from not successful people, right? I mean, one of the people you mentioned, who I will not identify specifically, says 10 things in a day, and 7 of them are completely idiotic.
Right.
And you have to ignore them. And 2 of them are interesting enough that you really have to think about it.
And 1 is brilliant.
And 1 is the thing that will sell 10 million copies of your game, and the trick is figuring out which is which,
Yeah.
So Fireteam.
Oh, briefly, one of the guys left LookGlass, Ned Lerner, founded a company around the internet, which was going to be a big deal, supposedly. And Art Min, again, the guy from Terra Nova, said he was a project leader. He said, hey, we need a lead designer. How would you like to come out? Art and I did our interview in the town in Diablo. Everybody else had left the game, and we were selling our stuff, and then we walked out to the center of town. It was raining on us, and, standing there in all this armor, with the fires burning around us. And we are text chatting like, what would it take for you to come out here to California? Oh, well, that's not enough money, blah, blah, blah. I'd have to pay moving costs. And so these 2, over-the-top, masculine, dark warrior guys, standing there in the field while it's raining. And okay, let's talk about it later, but that sounds like a good deal, And so it was perfect for Multitude, an internet video game company that we did my interview. Anyway, it was the first game with voice like that, and so you wore a headset and played. It was a great experience. I lived in California, the Bay Area, for a while, worked with those guys, and then I came back to work with Warren on Deus Ex.
I tried for months to get you back, too.
Yeah.
I remember we were at Manuel's, and I think that was where I convinced you.
It was a good experience, though. I mean, it was a video game in the video game sense more than anything I had ever worked on. And if you ever get that opportunity, I highly recommend it. Like, you might want to make, Halo-style shooters, or you might want to make, like, a big role-playing game, like, an MMO, like World of Warcraft. You might, but if you ever get a chance just to work on an arcade game, you should, because it teaches you a lot. Everything is compressed in time, and so the user has way little patience, and everything has to happen very rapidly, and all the feedback has to be very clear. So in a way, it is the distilled form of the video game. And if you learn that part, then you can go apply it. Like, we're making a first-person shooter with a social commentary. Blacksite is anti-industrial military complex. And but I don't feel like we could do that unless I understood the mechanics behind point and click and 50 millisecond response time and enough feedback for the user to know what's happening around him, things like that.
So this game, it was kind of sports oriented as much as anything else. It was like a sporting event.
You're running around with
5 minute,
guns.
like little
10-minute games.
10-minute
yeah.
games online. It sounds perfect. What happened?
The people that founded the company believed very strongly in the internet as a business model, and they said we are going to only sell the game over the internet. You can only buy this game. The part of the business problem with the video games industry is the middleman. Retailers, publishers, whatever. We are going to start a company. We're going to make a game with venture capital money, and we are then going to put it on websites and sell it to people, and no one gets a cut of it but us and the guys that gave us the money. And that's a great idea. And that's what companies like NCSoft are doing now. And that's what is going to be the business model of the future. Xbox Live is only the first tiptoe in the water, right? But at the time, it was way too early. It was like 1997 or something. And the broadband hadn't really happened yet, and no one was comfortable buying stuff over the internet yet.
It was the 3DO of video games then.
Yeah. Too early. Yeah.
Too early. Well, and then there was DX. I mean, you made a lot of contributions to this. I mean, Harvey came in as one of the leads. I had foolishly 2 lead designers. Never do that, by the way. Ultimately had to make a decision, and Harvey became the lead designer and really functioned more as a co-director than
I
a lead designer.
Deus Ex, again, one of the best learning experiences ever, but when I look back on it, I think there's so many people at so many levels that contributed to it. And the team even seems small by today's standards, weirdly. But when I think
25.
about my interaction with you and Chris Norden, it seems like the soul of the game, like maybe not the soul of the game, but the place where it really happened, like decisions got made, features got cut.
Ego.
Yeah, like me and Warren and Chris would sit in a room and fight like cats and dogs. And then at a lower level, I also worked with the design team. So like I'd be in a room with all the guys putting the chairs and the bottle of water on the table. We were set decorating for the whole environment, And that experience was fantastic too. That was like only the second time I had been a level designer. And I really enjoyed that. That was still to this day one of the most enjoyable parts of my, because I at the time my then wife was a teacher, and she went to work. We had to get up. I had to get there at 7, which most people didn't roll in at a video game company until like 10, right? And so I would get there at 7, and I would work for 3 hours before anyone else walked in the building. And so what I would do later in the game is I would have arguments or design systems or work on fiction or whatever with other guys. But for 3 hours in the morning, all I would do is build levels and move things around in the levels and script AIs to do certain things. And it was a very powerful experience.
Like I said, you made huge contributions to this game. I mean, and I think you don't get enough credit for it, but there were 2 that stood out for me that I look back on them and I go, oh my God, thank God, Harvey was there to just point these 2 things out. So I wanted to get your take, because we've never actually talked about this, I don't think. But and they're not even necessarily the most important things in the game, but you redesigned the skill system. I mean, I had a skill system that I thought was really going to be cool, and you redesigned it. Do you even remember that?
Was I think one of the things that we were both sort of absorbing at the time from the people around us, like, was the notion of lesser granularity, so that like, if a change happens in the game, you notice it. Yeah. And even though we tricked ourselves into thinking that we had that figured out at the time, I'm still learning that. If it's not demonstrable to the player, don't do it, that kind of thing. But at the time, we boiled it down to like 4 tiers for every skill.
Well,
tree,
you did.
right?
When you came on the project, the skill system was binary. It was on-off. It was you had the skill, you could do something. You didn't have the skill, you couldn't. And I thought that was simple and streamlined. And see, he doesn't even remember this. This is awesome. One of the most critical decisions in the game.
Right.
And you came up with a completely different system that was more granular than that, and that made it work. Okay, so we're not going to talk about this because you don't even remember it. Great.
Yeah. That's the funny thing about video games is like, and it must be true for everything, is like if you actually were in the room when something was happening, like the version that gets reported later or whatever is so radically different.
It's all Rashomon. If you haven't seen the movie Rashomon, just go see it.
Yeah, totally different perspectives and so much granular. It's also signal loss. Like, you say something to the effect of, in 1965, Richard Nixon met with so-and-so and they discussed blah. and that's like a sentence, right? And if you think about it, like the last time you met with somebody and discussed something, think about all the different emotional things that were going on, what had fed into your day, the little struggles that were going on, how many times you changed your mind. It's all lost. All that's gone. The next day it's gone, probably from you maybe even. And certainly if anybody ever reports on what you did, it's some sort of retardedly simple version of what actually happened.
Well, speaking of retarded, anyway, not simple necessarily, the other big thing on Deus Ex was I had this incredibly grandiose story with missions that were just huge, and the Russo-Mexican alliance attacking Austin. I mean, what the heck was I thinking? And I remember you and Steve Powers grabbed me and dragged me out to lunch.
We tried to ground it more.
And just said, we can't express this story.
Right.
And so
I do remember that.
What was it? And pitched a simpler variation of the same story. It expressed everything that I hoped we could express. But
in retrospect, I don't think it was like we had it figured out and you didn't or anything like that. I think it was that
I do.
On a daily basis, we were building the rooms. And so we knew how long it took us to prop out one room and to set up the AI for it. And we knew how big the room could be before the renderer choked, or how many guys we were successfully getting on screen. So I think part of it was that, just if you use the tools, like I don't use the tools anymore. And so I routinely suggest things that the guys around me are like, whoa, we can't do that because you'd have too many meta connections there or whatever. And I'm just like, oh, okay, let's not do that then. But part of it was that intimacy with the technology. And then I think part of it was, it took me a while to realize this, but like one of the best things about BioShock, for instance, is that when you stop and think about a game from outside, you very often add way too much detail or way too much to it. Like you think about it like a fully functional world with thousands of characters, and that's fine if you're making a sim game or something, but very often a story is about a handful of people. And BioShock, a game that I've been playing along with Stranglehold on my Xbox, and I also play BioShock over Steam, by the way, but it really is the story of this one guy, Andrew Ryan, who had this crazy vision. And then at a deeper level, it's the story, at a more personal level for the player, it's the story of like rescuing or not these little girls. And it's like really, when I think about the game, there's probably 5 characters in that game that I would identify. The team would tell you there are probably hundreds, but I don't care. There's like crazy male scientists, crazy female scientists. There's Andrew Ryan, the designer, architect of all of this in a thinly veiled version of Ayn Rand. And there's the big daddies and the little sisters. And I can't think of anything else. That's it. My turret, whatever. And I think that was part of it too, is just this intuitive sense that this was too crazy, there was too much, and that it would be more personal or more intimate if I was wrong about tons of stuff from a story standpoint, of course, but that one certainly, like, we need to focus. And I had some example of this earlier where I was thinking, like, if we had known this on this other project, we also would have focused that down too. Like, Deus Ex still had a non-stop cast where people were walking on stage constantly, and the sequel is even worse. And I tried to even fight this on the sequel, and we failed at it. But it was like guys would walk on screen and walk off screen, and then you never talk to them again, or you talk to them an hour later. And it's just so hard for the designer, writer, game developer, engineer to recognize that when the player goes into a room in your game, everything is new. Like, even if you've played 100 shooters before, any little thing that's new, like squad morale, like we've got in Blacksite, we don't do a good enough job about giving enough feedback about what it is and how it's supposed to work. And so, like, the best games, I think, are the ones that take a small set of characters and repeat them over and over. That's the only chance you have by the end of the game for anyone to care about the characters, I think, is to just same guys over and over, repeat exposure.
And we came to that realization on Deus Ex
Yeah.
very late. I mean, it was probably
With
a
6
year.
months to go.
It was
or
probably
something.
a year after
Yeah.
you came to me and said, we've just got to change the story.
One of the best things we did on Deus Ex was Warren went and fought for 6 more months' time from the publisher, which was great. And somebody, I think it might have been Austin Grossman, the author of Soon I Will Be Invincible, the supervillain novel, and also who's worked on a number of games, said it's just kind of weird that you introduce some of these characters, you interact with them a little bit, and then they're just gone. He shows up in Mission 1, he shows up in Mission 2, he shows up in Mission 4, and then you never hear from him again. What happened to that guy? And it was a powerful question because it was one of the basics of storytelling that we as video game designers weren't yet applying. And so we went back and we went through all the characters. We put them on a whiteboard.
Yeah.
And we went back and we said, Gunther Herman shows up here, vanishes. What kind of ending could we write for that guy? And we don't have a lot of time, so it has to be simple. And so we said, okay, well, we have this data link, which is just a means of like playing a voice file with an image, right? So what if when you're crawling around in Paris, which is kind of a random mission right now with no real point to it, what if we have Gunther Herman sending you these little taunts saying that because he's a cyborg, he's watching you through the satellites. So whenever you're on the roof, he can see you. When you're down in the alley, he can't. When you're in the building, he can't. So I only put the taunts when you were on the roof, and you would trigger them on a roof, and Gunther would say that he was watching you from the satellites. And it started to reintroduce the concept of this character. And then you have a big showdown with him in a church where he's holding a rocket launcher or something. And so, you know, at least you got to kill Gunther. At least you got to I think you either fought him or you had learned through a side mission before that all the cyborgs had these like kill codes built into them by the government. And so in the conversation, this was a brilliant moment for us. I have to pat us on the back for this. This is so cool.
Really fun.
You had this other quest like hours before where somebody was like, by the way, I know the kill codes for the cyborgs that you used to work with. And if you pay me, I'll give it to you. And so if you were the player that paid for it, you had this option in the conversation. You could either say, let's go, let's fight, bring it, and then throw down with him and fight in the church. Or you could say, by the way, I happen to know your kill code. Here it is. And we put this long string of text up, and he just goes, ah, and dies. It was fantastic.
Magic moment.
Yeah.
Magic moment.
So anyway, we went back and we gave all the characters, like, a finale, basically.
So then we got to Invisible War. And you stepped up again, took a project leadership position.
This was a very difficult project for me. I was basically, personally, I was going through a separation that would eventually end in a divorce. And on top of that, I feel like we fucked up the technology management of it. We screwed up we had bad team chemistry. We wrote the wrong renderer. We wrote the wrong kind of AI. And then we shipped too early. And the story was even bad. Like, it wasn't a bad story. It was more like we moved into the future, which really, we didn't realize at the time, but undermined a lot of what made Deus Ex great. A lot of what made Deus Ex great was the familiarity, the groundedness. You're going through an alley, jumping up on a dumpster to get to a fire escape to break into somebody's apartment. And we've all seen alleys and chain link fences and dumpsters. So it's very powerful, it's very grounded. And we moved it further into the future, and it started to feel like the Jetsons or, some sort of space type thing or something. I don't know. So I think in the end we made, an 85% rated RPG that was not a worthy sequel to the original game as in terms of how interesting the original game was. And that's unfortunate. It was also my first console game, though, and it is a different beast to work on a console game. You have to think about the interface and the memory differently and everything else. So.
But there were, I don't want to turn this into a mutual flagellation society here or anything, but there were certain things that we saw as problems in Deus Ex that we very explicitly wanted to address. So
That's a great point.
Can you talk about what you thought some of those problems were? And because they really informed, I'll start talking if you don't, so you're really better.
No, it's a really good point. Like we listened, the lesson I've learned on Blacksite is like really talk to the players that you're aiming at. Like you will have some hardcore friend who will tell you the most extreme version of what you're supposed to do, and that would be cool. And you'll lose 90% of the audience if you do that. And you just always have to remember, it's not selling out to cater to an audience, right? Like, what are you doing? If you want to make an indie game, sit in your closet and make an indie game and release it for 4 guys on the internet. That's great. That's totally noble. Some of my friends have done that. I highly recommend that if that's what drives you. There's a recent game called The Marriage. Super, super indie, low budget. The guy did it in a weekend. It was brilliant. If, on the other hand, you're taking $20 million of somebody's money and you are on the surface aiming at an Xbox Live crowd, then going to some crazy extreme is probably not a good idea, right? Unless it's an extreme that will take your audience to some new interesting place, and they can, and then if you are going to do that, you're going to spend 80% of the project communicating with the user about this new thing that's interesting, because it's going to take that. Anyway, so what we did with, I think what we did with Deus Ex was we listened to our super hardcore friends who told us, here's how I would fix Deus Ex. I mean, we had some friends, some good friends, who told us that Deus Ex was a giant disaster, and here's what they would change. And I love those guys, and we really felt sensitive about that. We really felt like, God, we're not meeting the demands, or we're not meeting the standards of our very intelligent designer friends. So ashamed. Let's fix all that in the sequel. And we weren't listening to the players of the original game who liked what we had done. And so in trying to fix some of those things, redundant things, like we had skills and augmentations that were overlapping and redundant. So we eliminated those. We boiled them all down into one system, which was easier on the console interface. It was easier to learn, but it didn't allow for certain combinations that, even if they weren't mechanically interesting, they built a fantasy in the player's head. Like, hey, I could let you take the swimming skill and the aqualung augmentation, or I could give you a biomod for the sequel that is called Swimmer or whatever, and it has both built into it. And they're mechanically the same. This one gives you plus 50% breath capacity, and it lets you swim 30% faster at the max level. This biomod could do both of those things. It's fine. But it wasn't the same to the user. The user wanted the fantasy of thinking, I am the aquatic guy, therefore I'm going to take up these slots and these slots to be the aquatic guy in combination. Even though mechanically, economically, it's the same, in the fantasy, it's different. And so, basically, hindsight is 20/20.
Yep. So we've been going for a little more than an hour and a half. I'm thinking maybe we should take a little break.
That sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
Come back and take a look at some Blacksite and let you talk about where you are now.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, so we'll take about 10 minutes. Come on back.
And I don't know exactly where to stand or how to do this, but this is a game that is not out yet. It should be out in early November. It's called Blacksite Area 51. Briefly, let me tell you about the history of the game. So in Europe, by the way, it's just called Blacksite, and if I had my way, it would be called Blacksite here. So Midway owns the IP for the Area 51 franchise, the old light gun game. And at some point, some executive in some boardroom thought, hey, we should reinvent that. And so they had a studio do a PS2 game called Area 51. And so when I signed on with Midway, I signed on to do a different game. I signed on to both be the studio creative director and build the department up and hire people like Juliana out of the program at UT, for instance, and also to shepherd the 2 games along. So I was doing that, and I was way more into one of the other games. It was more open world RPG. I was way more into it, and I kind of wasn't paying attention as much to the Area 51 game. I wasn't that interested in it, frankly. And at a certain point, it kind of got in trouble, and my boss asked me to step in and try to find the good parts and elevate them and shape the team differently, yada, yada, yada. So I've worked for the last 10 months very directly with the Area 51 team, and at a certain point, I recast the story. I came in with a 1-page thing saying, hey, this is what I would rather do story-wise. I said I want to call the game Blacksite. A few people were like, what, are you crazy? You just came in yesterday and you want to change the story, you want to change the feature set, you want to call the game something different. And I was really outraged politically at the time, and I don't want to shove my views down anybody else's throat, but whether you're on the left like I am, or you're on the right, or you're somewhere in the middle, or whatever, you know, I think all of us don't believe that our government should lie to us. We don't. None of us probably believe that it's a good idea for corporations to have a vested interest in keeping wars going and things like that, right? So I was really angry about some things politically that I won't go into here. And I said a black site is, I'm very much in favor of open government. Like, you know, if you've got a process, you should reveal it. If you've got a voting machine, you should show us the algorithm. So A, we can all make sure it's not buggy, and B, we can make sure it's not corrupt. Because as we all know, all governments end up with corruption in them if you don't have oversight, right? There's enough history to tell us that. So in any case, a black site is a disavowed site where people do unethical things. And Abu Ghraib is a black site, you know, like Guantanamo Bay is a black site. So I thought about it and I was like, well, I'm bored with Area 51. I don't want to do an Area 51 game. And then it occurred to me that Area 51 in our collective mythos is like a black site, essentially. So I started working on this game idea that was a twist to what the team was doing, and it would involve a flashback to Iraq, looking for a bunker with weapons of mass destruction in it. It would involve U.S. soldier Delta Force guys on the ground operating in American small towns. It would basically be a political satire. You know, there are missions called things like "mission accomplished" in quotes, and just a piece of paper, which Bush allegedly said about the U.S. Constitution. You know, so it was kind of a sarcastic, ironic, like let's use a Delta Force FPS game, a first-person shooter, and tell a story that kind of undermines the basic implicit political values of those types of games. That's what I was thinking. And so we kept working on it. I finally got to the point where I was pretty happy with it. I don't think it's the most polished game I've ever worked on, but it is the first like pure shooter that I've worked on in quite a while. You know, it's just like straight up first-person perspective shooter. We added some things like a squad command system that works with one button, and we added a squad morale system, so your squad's mood is changing. It's using Unreal technology and all these other middleware companies. So anyway, let me just fire the game up and show you a little bit. So each chapter has a different thematic menu system. And this one was designed to evoke war in the Middle East and gritty, scratchy kind of vibe. And so, you know, a lot of work. I don't know if some of you go into games, you will probably be working on UI or audio or any number of these things. But this is the Xbox Live version, so I could start, I could load my save game or load a particular episode or start a new campaign. I could play co-op with one other person. I'd have to sign into Xbox to do that. Xbox Live. I could play a competitive match. I could slowly unlock pieces of story through the game called dossiers. And when I unlock them, it replaces this squad icon with, as you can see in my current playthrough, I've only unlocked part of them. It's like a little detail about one of the characters, Logan Summers. The achievements, if you're an Xbox Live player, this is very powerful. Can you hear me just talking like this? Oh, you're recording too, okay, sorry. Okay, how's that? You know, I thought achievements were a dumb idea when I first heard about them, but I'll wrap it around my throat. But achievements are a collectible, and players love collectibles, like collectible baseball cards, Pokemon stuff, whatever, like. And so Microsoft has leveraged this system into something that gamers sort of compete with one another. How many achievements do you have? How many do I have, etc. And so this is not actually going out over Xbox Live. When you have a development kit, it goes over this thing called PartnerNet, and it's not hooked up to PartnerNet right now. It's kind of got it mirrored on the local hard drive. But this is what it would look like. Yeah, this box is called Super Ninja Killer. But as I completed various parts, you know, it unlocks an achievement, and so that's actually become a big deal in games. And I think we're at the age where like game development teams are going to start doing clever things with achievements. Like there's one from a game last year called, I can't remember what it's called, but it was a viral one, where every member of the development team starts with the condition, and that the only way you can get the achievement is by playing a game against somebody who played a game against somebody. Every time somebody else plays a game with somebody from the original development team, it spreads, so it goes out virally. And so, you know, a year later, you know, you can play just about anybody and get it, right? But it's pretty clever. So we put in different control schemes, of course, and we played around with this a lot. We don't trust ourselves, so even after getting it as good as we thought it was, we bring in like dozens of blind testers, just like people off the street, to play the game. And ideally, in this case, we're hoping that they played a few first-person shooters or console games. So the game starts with a flashback mission to Iraq. And in keeping with our political satire theme, we call our difficulty levels threat level yellow, orange, and red. I believe sometimes the best way to disarm people that are trying to use fear to manipulate you is just to laugh at them. And so, you know, we've done that here. I'm going to put it on orange because morale matters a lot more in orange. And so we've got all these loading screens that are taken from screenshots and doctored up with a little hint text. And the game starts with a cinematic. All of our cinematics are in-engine, and they don't. They kind of keep you restricted to a seat or a room or something, but they're not totally non-interactive.
Hey Summers, how much further?
So what we've got here is some Special Forces guys riding in the back of a goat truck.
You get out. You get out there.
Rendezvous with Ambrose here and pick up our interpreter. Her name is Noah Weiss.
Hey Rashid, how about you turn that crap down?
Iraqis have been
We wanted
stockpiling
to
weapons
make
and
them as
years.
much like
Russian ordnance.
you know,
You
Blackwater
can expect some
guys
heavy
or Delta
resistance.
Force guys
Hey,
as possible.
$50 says I kill more fettuccine than you.
Make it 100 and you're on.
And so, like, this was one of those moments when we said, you know, we're going to start in a goat truck. We need goats. The producers looked at us like we were nuts. What?
ما الذي تحمله؟
So they've come to a checkpoint. The driver's arguing with somebody.
نحن نسكن في القرية التالية. سنتأكد من ذلك. إذا ما قمت بأي حركة مفاجئة، سيقوم رجالي بقتلك. انتبه. أطلق النار.
Let's take it to him!
So one of the features in the game is
Got his ass!
there's a lot of breakables in the environment.
Eagle, this is Echo. Come in. No
So
good.
you can use those
This canyon's blocking our
strategically.
signal. We gotta move to higher ground.
Up there! That radio tower!
Good eyes. That's our target. Let's move. Remember the rules of engagement, Grayson. None of that John Wayne bullshit.
Yeah!
So it's a little unrealistic in that you can tear everything up, but you know, it basically means the player will be in a gunfight and you know, things will be breaking all around him. And this is our area where we try to start high drama, but we also try to ease you into the game, you know. So I can press the right bumper and give a squad command, and my squad will go more or less to that area, but they're semi-autonomous. So they'll try to take cover, you know,
Here we go.
or pick targets out.
Take him out! Target eliminated!
So I can also focus fire on a particular guy. I can tell them to attack that guy. It's really super washed out on this monitor, by the way. And so for the early part of the game, we use villages and, you know, wrecked overpasses and Iraqi bunkers and things like that. It's just like the topical backdrop for the missions. Our audio department is really awesome. Like, we've got this whole dynamic score going, and you know, things change based on the intensity of play. And it's kind of obscure until you've played the game for a while, but their mood is rising and falling during combat, and they're more effective if their morale is high, and they're less effective if their morale is low. So periodically, if you see on the screen high morale, it's because I'm making headshots and you know, I'm giving them orders and focusing them on targets, you know, things like that. I'll play through this area, then I'm going to load something else up.
Incoming!
So a lot of the game, squad games, obviously, you know, you can play multiple ways. You can either like get actively involved or hang back and give orders. Squad morale is low right now, so it kind of creates a positive feedback loop where the game gets harder. And I have to do more to compensate for that because my squad gets really conservative. They hang back. Of course, I've been playing the game for a year, so you know, it's I barely notice it anymore. But like, you know, new players who are playing on higher difficulty levels, they have to manipulate the squad more. One of my guys just went down. Ouch. So I'm dead. And we do the checkpoint system where, you know, the last checkpoint you've advanced to, it backs up. We use all over the place this black and white version of the American flag. Anyway, as you go through the game, each little chapter point, they stop, and you know, once the action dies down, there's like a little dialogue around it. And we filled it with subversive concepts, I guess, like, you know, you drive through an oil refinery at one point and everybody's firing at you, and at a lull in the middle of that, somebody says, "Jesus, who arms refinery workers?" And the other guy goes, "Dude, I think they bought this shit from us." You know, so it's just like, it's full of one-liners like that. In keeping with the, you know, the political satire.
On my way.
So let me load up another environment.
Target acquired. Get him! Fire in the hole! Target eliminated.
So for me, it's like, if I had my preference, every game that I made would be, you know, like a much slower pace, highly exploration-based. But the thing is, sometimes you go to war with the army you have, so to speak. And the technology base that we had, Unreal, and the time constraints that I was under, and the franchise IP that I had to work with as a professional game developer, like, you know, accepting money from my publisher, I had to, you know, sort of like figure out the passion angle on this. Like, what would I like to do with this, you know? And so throughout my career, sometimes I've worked on things that are just like, I absolutely love, and there's nothing I would rather be working on than this. And then at other times, I've worked on things that, you know, like, it's taken me a while to figure out what it was about a simple shooter that I would like. You know, where am I going to push the envelope? I think you should always be trying to push the envelope somewhere, right? And so in our case, it's like, okay, well, if we're going to make a scripted first-person shooter, let's try to work with this morale feature. And yet at the same time, we have to make it lightweight enough where, like, the average player won't get hindered by it, right? It's not a board game where you can make an economic decision early on that just totally screws your game. It's not that kind of game. It's a story that the average player should be able to follow along with. So the morale system is what it is, and the political satire, those are the two areas I would say where we actually are doing something a little different other than that, it's a shooter, and in those cases, we try to follow best practices, right? So like there's a bunch of shooters out there, and I love shooters, and although I'm not so good with the grenade right now. But, oh, I did it twice. I can't talk, I can't lecture and fight at the same time. But anyway, it's like, you know, I believe that you should pick your battles, you know, pick the places where you're going to try to do something different. Play with some feature, some design element, or some fiction that nobody else has done. And then in all other cases, look at what are best practices, right? Like the shooters that are highly successful, that make players very happy, what do they do? And so in many cases, in terms of like reload mechanics and interface and things like that, like those aren't the new interesting parts of our game. In those cases, you know, it's like making a movie, right? If you're making a movie and you figure out, hey, I can make this whole movie from first-person perspective, that'd be totally wild and different. It's a bad idea. Somebody tried it once, but whatever. Let's say you figured out that you could do some parts of it. Blair Witch is a very good movie, and it did the same thing. So that's totally legitimate, I think, in terms of filmmaking. Making seats that, like, shock the audience or something like that feels like a gimmick to me, right? That I want to sit in a comfortable seat in the dark and look at the screen and immerse myself in the movie. In terms of film, I don't want to go suddenly find that I have a rattlesnake under my chair because that makes it more exciting or whatever. And so, in that same way, if we make a game with a morale system and political satire for the fiction, we sort of undermine the standard Delta Force shooter. I think in all the other ways, it's a totally valid thing to like look for how do checkpoints work in most shooters? What is the user expectation there? You know, or else you're going to be communicating constantly. Like, you know, you just never can. You can never underestimate how much effort it takes to communicate something new to a player in a game. If you're doing something no one's done before, you're going to spend tons of time just explaining the fundamental concept to them. It's one of the things that makes games so hard. With Deus Ex, we spent so much time telling the player, no, really, you could either go kill that guy or just talk to him. Really, try it, you know. And it just wasn't something players were used to. Looking at all this, it's like the last year for me working in the trenches on the game. Let's see. So these are the mission names, for instance. This is the whole game unlocked, whereas like if you were the player, you get these one at a time. And so these are mostly like phrases that people have used to describe the Iraq situation or the last 6 years with the Bush administration. Somebody call FEMA. It's a great name for a mission. Boots on the ground, the first casualty of war is truth, right? Coalition of the willing, targets of opportunity, homeland security. This is about this redneck guy defending his gas station. And so, anyway. Let's see, so what should I do from here? Should I load up another mission environment? Or? Yeah, so this is a small town environment with, oh, and by the way, the big threat in the game isn't just aliens. Actually, the aliens are incidental. We do have Xenos running around in the world. The big threat is actually an insurgency. The core of the plot revolves around this point, that the American government with a Black Ops program is taking wounded or KIA soldiers and homeless people and illegal immigrants and drifters and experimenting on them to make Soldier 2.0. And eventually, they sort of break free and become an insurgency on U.S. soil. So these Delta Force guys are actually fighting former U.S. soldiers who have been turned into killing machines by this Black Ops program. And now those guys call themselves the Reborn Insurgency. And so even the very nature of the plot here is just highly subversive. And so this is our version of Rachel, Nevada. You've just pulled up. And the streets are all wet. Lots of things are breakable.
Yeah, I don't like those prices either.
So your squad is constantly, you know, one of the lessons I learned from my friend Richard Rouse worked on a game called The Suffering. And The Suffering had this interesting game mechanic where if you're successful in moving through this haunted prison, you find these guys and you find them one at a time and you keep them alive. And then at a certain point they get to exit. He uses the convention over and over of like, your name is Torque in that game. It's like, Torque, hold the door open. It's a heavy door. It's like, I'm going to slip out and I'll meet you at the end. Sorry you can't come, but one of us has to hold the door. So Torque holds the door open. The question of why the other guy doesn't just prop the door open never gets asked. But he holds the door open, the guy slips out. And so you've been successful. You've kept that prisoner alive and you've let him live. If you play badly, halfway through the course where you're with that guy, because the game is a long linear course, right? Halfway that guy might die. And what I found playing this game, which I liked a lot, by the way, if you're into horror and shooters, you might like The Suffering. What I found was that the game was way better when I was keeping the guy alive. So from a drama perspective, there was a positive feedback loop that made the game worse if I played worse. In other words, if I was successful, the game was better. It was more interesting because a human being was running along with me, talking, chattering. If I was a bad player, the game got even worse. If I was having a bad time with the game got even worse. And so, you know, we wanted to put these squad mates with you. We have 4 different squad mates, and we cycle them out along the way. And at first, they're all just the same to you. But after an hour of play, 2 hours, you really come to know their names, their histories. This guy, Mitchell Ambrose, wherever he's taking cover at. Oh, there he is. He's from New Orleans. And so he constantly alludes to, you know, what happened with Katrina. And, you know, he uses little opportunities like somebody will say, like, man, the roads are for shit out here. The roads washed out. And he's like, yeah, like the levees in New Orleans. And when you first meet him, you first pull up at base camp. And he's like, Pierce, I haven't seen you in a while. He pulls out a picture to show you his new daughter. And we use this classic photo from Katrina where this dude is standing like waist deep in water holding this little baby girl. And it's like this harrowing, award-winning photo of just these people who had their lives, you know, just wiped out by nature, basically. And, you know, so we constantly draw from all of these, like, the last 6 years, basically, of things that have made us angry. And but over time, you get to know Mitchell Ambrose. And we've got some lifelike squad features that, you know, periodically he knows to take cover. And if you look at him, it's human to make eye contact and then to ask you, like, hey, what's going on? But also, that's at war with, if I get too close to him, he knows that I want to get in that spot, so he gets out of my way so the game doesn't get obnoxious like that. And this is Grayson. If he wasn't in Delta Force, he'd be in prison. He's kind of our comic relief, and he's the complete warrior, Richard Marchenko style. And he allows us to make commentary on things like the Blackwater Mercenary Group. You know, if the United States government can pay corporations to train troops and use them for security in wars, those corporations are probably free from things like the Geneva Convention. And so, like, there's total questionable gray area, politically speaking, around the use of mercenaries in conflicts. And so we're constantly touching on some of that stuff.
Form up on the door. Ah! Take it down. All right.
Shut the lip sync.
It's armed. Clear! Clear!
Come on, Star, come on!
What's that? Civilian.
What the hell are you?
So this is one of the more exotic forms of the Reborn insurgency.
Take him out. Engaging hostile.
So I'm going to tell my squad to focus on that guy.
Watch out for the gas pump.
And when he's killed, if he's headshotted or killed by an explosion, he goes down. Otherwise, his torso tears away from his body and crawls toward me. He tries to suicide bomb by getting close to me. So once again, you know, trying to take things in the world like suicide bombings and like work with that material somehow.
I need some help.
These are the more common reborn soldiers who are former U.S. soldiers. Let me back in the convenience store, please. Anyway, so yeah. So why don't we switch to whatever Warren has more questions or Q&A? Or
I always have more questions. Okay. Get myself a mic again. Are you letting me do that?
No, I guess I should exit out, huh?
That's okay. All right, so I want to ask a couple more things, because if I don't ask them now, I'm going to have to ask them in the car on the way back. Oh, sure.
About those tooltips that are displayed during the loading screen. One thing personally I found so irritating about these tooltips is that sometimes like you'll see something and then it'll fall off screen and then you'll never see it again, or it'll take a long time to see it again. And very rarely some of these you want to see. So is there like someplace that you'll be able to read all these tooltips in one location, maybe like an extra or somewhere in the option screen?
You know, I think that's actually a very clever idea, and I think I would even go as far as to say soon that will be considered best practice. I think I can name a couple of games where you can do that. I think you can do that in Stranglehold, and I think you can do it in BioShock. And I think the original game that did that was Warcraft 1, the RTS, where you could just cycle through the tips of the day. But I don't think we do it. You know, in the end, it's so funny, like, you typically write your tooltips, or your pro tips, as we call them, toward the end of the project, based on what people are confused about. Like in our game, people didn't realize that with the analog trigger, if you pull it halfway with a sniper weapon, you zoom halfway. If you pull it all the way, you zoom all the way. And so we added a pro tip for that. But we consider it kind of like a stopgap, you know, like, hey, it would be better if the game trained you with help text in the game or with voice lines or whatever. But for the X% of the audience that's going to miss this or that, let's add another layer of help feedback, you know, and hopefully the player will see half of those. And if he doesn't, it's probably not a big deal. But you're right, it would be better to be able to go to like a little encyclopedia and just cycle through all of them. Okay. Do you want to roll with your questions?
Yeah,
before we
I
go
just
to
got
Q&A?
a couple things here, and then, you know, I got the mic on, so I get to do this. I have a whole section of questions about game design philosophy, which I don't really think we have time to go into, but there are some core ideas that I think that you've spoken about a lot that seem to inform a lot of your work. And what I was thinking I'd do is just throw them out there and have you just give the nickel version, so they get the benefit of some of your experience.
Before you, I would love to do that, but let me mention Blacksite briefly in that context. So one of the things that's interesting about design ideas or philosophies is that every time you come up with one, or you articulate it, or you hear somebody else articulate it, one that you like, one of your really smart friends will find a way to undermine it. And they will point out just as validly how the opposite is actually true. And so one of the frustrating things about something like games, as subjective as games are, is that you will never actually know what the rules are. Because you can say something like, you know, alternation of gameplay setup, which is one of my core values. And somebody else will say that equates to a schizophrenic experience. My belief is that human beings respond to alternation. They respond to contrast. If you study architecture, you know that curvy shapes versus, you know, rectilinear shapes, large scale versus small scale, you know, all these things are worked into alternating patterns in architecture that people find pleasing. And so for me, alternation of color palette, alternation of gameplay setup, you know, this time I'm defending a convenience store, next time I'm way underpowered, but my squad mate is in a helicopter, and so I'm painting targets for him and he's shooting at them. Just that constant alternation goes a long way in terms of making the experience enjoyable. Somebody you know will turn that on its head, first of all. And so with Blacksite, briefly, I feel like 3 or 4 of my fundamental beliefs we hit, and 3 or 4 of my most dearly held beliefs went under the bus. You know, I feel like the game is fairly immersive. It has a good story. We keep getting blind test feedback that says, hey, I'm into the characters and the one-liners and things and the plot. I feel like it is it alternates environment and it alternates gameplay setup. But in terms of like differentiated creature mechanics, I think the thing I just showed you, unfortunately I killed it with an explosion, so we didn't get to see it do its second stage behavior, which is it falls down and the torso tears itself off, and then its palms slap the concrete as it crawls across the ground toward you and tries to suicide bomb. But I believe all creatures ought to be differentiated. No other creature in the game should be able to do that. And I also believe in second stage mechanics. So you fight this one thing one way, and then a change happens, and it's crawling on the ground toward you. It's at a different elevation and everything. I think even the best arcade games, like Pac-Man, have second stage mechanics. There's one way you interact with the ghosts at one moment, and then there's another way you interact with them, in a different phase of the game, a different mode of the game. And so some of my values got carried across to this game, and some just got trashed. And I think every project you ever work on is going to be like that.
I don't even have to ask the question. Okay, the first one was, when I say the words orthogonal unit differentiation, what do you mean? And I think you just answered that one.
Yeah, that was, by the way, I learned two things, I think, a few years ago. One was, don't bury the lead. If you have a central point, I used to always build up toward it. And I realized, like, my God, list it first. If you're listing a series of bullet points, or you want to explain to somebody why this one thing is cool, start with the strongest thing. Don't bury the lead. And the other thing I've learned is, don't use a $5 word when a $1 word will suffice. Early on with this project, I kept using the term gameplay vignette, and I could have said gameplay setup, and I would have gotten way more traction from the team earlier. Early on, the level design team was just like, what's he talking about? And I was like, look, here's what I want to do. I want to build a list of gameplay vignettes. I want to try to abstract them out at a medium abstraction level. Like, the player is underpowered, moving around with a powerful ally overhead. And so the player can direct the powerful ally. And you could apply it to a fantasy game with a dragon, or a military game with an ally with a turret and a helicopter. That's a gameplay vignette. Another one might be, you're trapped in a room on the 3rd or the 15th floor, and down in the street, in a Hong Kong gangster type thing, type game or movie, and a mob boss is pulling up, and all of a sudden his limo is being hit by a rival gang, and you've got to, from the windows of the building, you've got to protect him by sniping his enemies or whatever. That's a gameplay vignette. Except I should have used the term gameplay setup, and people would have bought into it. They would have thought I wasn't being, they would have thought less likely, that they would have been less likely to think I was being pretentious or trying to be a smarty pants or whatever. So orthogonal unit differentiation, I should have said enemy differentiation or enemy mechanics or who knows.
How about emergent gameplay in 5 minutes or less?
So it's so funny because a lot of games are just inherently emergent by the interactions of low-level rules. But for a while, some of us were really pushing the notion of making the game as a chemistry set where the player's tools are, 5 things that can be combined in interesting ways to really allow the player to creatively solve problems. But yeah, emergent gameplay basically means that you have enough tools and the environment operates according to these very consistent rules where you can exploit those rules and combine your tools in different ways to solve your problems.
Sounds like you may be backing off that a little bit. Am I hearing a little bit?
No, I still am totally into that. It's just, I think the thing I've learned is that, you really have an economy to spend. You only have a certain amount of complexity to spend on the player. And that if you make every square inch of the environment something new or something without directionless, that the player can just experiment with, then really you better hope that players are signed up just for a sandbox experience, because that's more or less what it's going to equate to. You take a brilliant game like Grand Theft Auto, despite the subject matter, it is such a great example of a sandbox with some directed goals, So I guess I just, for me as a player, I would love the total sandbox experience. I don't think most people think like that. Most people are newer to games, or they want a little bit more direction, And it took me a while to wrap my head around that. I think it depends on what experience they're going after, you know. I also, there are always these discussions about like how much direction do players want? How much do they want this experience to be interactive truly? Because you'd think they would want it to be maximally interactive, but
And that's what they'd tell you.
they would tell you that, but they spend so much time frustrated in an open-ended environment that they're like, just give me some damn goals, you know? And the same argument comes up all the time. I'm a big proponent of story in games, but by that I don't mean plot. I often mean like fantasy. What is the fantasy here? You know, for this part of our game, you know, it's the fantasy of being a special forces guy or whatever. I played a game recently on Xbox Live Arcade. I can't remember what it's called. It's about bugs, roaches, and praying mantises and stuff. Does anybody remember what it's called? Band of Bugs? Yeah, it's a really good Xbox Live game, but the core mechanics are the core mechanics of XCOM. And I loved XCOM, and this is, in some ways, it's mechanically deeper than XCOM was. But they use this very friendly, like, the Roach King wants you as the young bug to come defend the kingdom. And, you know, the fantasy is something that I don't find that appealing, but the mechanics are really interesting. And it's one of those situations where it's a nerd game for me in some ways, because it's like height matters in terms of combat. Attacking from behind gives you a bonus. Flanking your enemies with somebody else gives you a bonus. There's all these tweaky mechanics, and the way that they get around that, I mean, eventually you're playing really deeply mechanical, you know, this deeply mechanical game. The way they get around it is the fantasy is so lightweight and it's so simple, and you never have to struggle to understand it. You know, it's just like, hey, young aphid, come learn how to defend the Roach Kingdom or whatever. I don't even know. They're all bugs. That's all I know.
I should
but
dig out my Roach Motel proposal from 1989. Gameplay ecology.
Oh yeah, that's a term that we started using at Midway because I realized that some people don't think like that, but I guess at Ion we all just thought like that, right? Sure. I don't think we needed a term for it because we just thought like that. But you know, the player has a series of tools, and they operate according to certain rules, and then the enemies have a certain series of rules that they operate by, and the environmental objects do as well. And you could sit down and plan your game just by thinking up lists, right? Like, here are the 8 enemies. They're all interesting. Look at them. And here are the 8 player tools or weapons, like the gravity gun or a grappling line or some mines or whatever, a camera. And here are the environmental objects. We'll have a water cooler over here and this over here. You could think like that, but you will get more interesting interactions, second-order consequences. You'll get more interesting emergent gameplay, I think, if you instead think of them as an interconnected structure, so that, like, if you only have the budget, if you only have the budget for 10 environmental objects, and you randomly create a water cooler, you're wasting one of your 10 slots. You just hit the red button. Thank you. But on the other hand, if you're making a game about fire, then that water cooler object might be really good, right? Because it might splash down and put out the fire. So then you think about it like, okay, my enemies are, vampires that burst into flame if I hit them with flame, and my weapons and tools are things like a jar with sunlight in it, or a flamethrower, or whatever. And then environmental objects are things like giant water coolers that the vampires, if they're on fire, can break to put the water out. You know, basically the whole idea is every chance you get to have a relationship between player tool, enemy behavior, and environmental object, the game gets stronger if there are relationships between those things.
And just as an aside, that's a great way to approach design. It's also a great way to think about games when you're doing analysis. So when we're in the analysis part of this course, great starting point. Can you suss out the rules by which the world operates? Great starting point. Okay, anyway, back to you. Customizable avatars.
Yeah, so I did the talk, the Imago effect, and it's really interesting, like, when the right call for that is, I totally believe in self-expression in games, but I also believe in strong narrative. So there's a time to customize the avatar, and there's a time to can the avatar. I think in general, if I could, in every game I made, customize the avatar and get everybody to buy into that, I would. But that's my personal preference, and I know not all gamers think like I do. Sometimes they would rather have a strong central lead. I think over years, I'm 40 now. I'm almost embarrassed to say that. I've been making games for 14 years.
Ever.
And I think over the years I've learned to be less dismissive of the player, and recognize that this is not purely an art form. It's a craft. It's part commercial, but I don't even care about the money side of it. All I'm saying is it's a dialogue between the player and the designer, and so it would be obnoxious for me as the designer to just do whatever I want without any regard for the player. It's a weird form. It's a very bizarre thing to make entertainment software, because you're constantly driven to want to express yourself and do your thing, but you're constantly doing it for a client.
Well, typically for millions of clients. That's
Hopefully.
the thing. Balancing out your need for creativity
Yeah.
and the player's need
Right.
to express him or herself. That's the big challenge.
Yeah, and so it's an ironic way to slice this particular argument up, but I would personally prefer the customizable avatar, and I believe that that's the one that would allow the player to express him or herself the best. However, if you actually look at what players gravitate toward, sometimes they want one flavor, sometimes they want the other. Sometimes they want a very strong story with a central figure in it that has thematic connections to all the other materials in the game. And then other times they want to just put together the right hair and skin color and clothing type and skills and weapon packages or whatever, the total customizable route.
All right, I got 3 more questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the crowd. What's the hardest part of making a game, and what's the most enjoyable part?
The hardest part, I remember us talking about that years and years ago, like, why is this so hard? And my answer to almost everything has changed over time as I've matured and figured things out, I'd like to think, and as I've learned lessons that people are now picking up instantly in class that took me years to stumble through, which is, I guess, an implicit way of saying that what you're doing is worthwhile if this is what you're trying to pursue. But my answer's never changed about what's hardest. And I know it's maybe a cop-out, but I always feel like the emotional component of the team is by far the hardest part. It's not just yourself, but it's the people around you, making everybody happy or explaining why you can't make them happy, dealing with, on any given project, there are people who totally love each other, and that causes problems because these two people get along better than everybody else. Or there are people that totally hate each other, or there are people that want to go one direction creatively, or who just don't get it. They're really good at their particular specialty, but they just don't understand. I could cite tons of examples of that. The designer that's passionate about the level flow, but doesn't get the story at all, or the engineer that is brilliant, math savant, but totally doesn't get why the artists need this particular color palette trick. It's just a group. You get 10 people into a room and try to get them to agree on anything, and you'll see how difficult it is. And imagine 60 people in a room, and the stakes are very high, and you've been working together for 2 years, and it gets harder and harder. And so that's why one of your skill sets, regardless of what your skill set is, if you look at yourself as a character sheet, you need to max out engineering or audio or whatever you do, and you need to max out collaboration. You need to be you need to learn how to put aside your own anger, how to interact with people professionally, how to listen to their views, how to lose arguments gracefully a certain percentage of the time, how to win arguments gracefully a certain percentage of the time. The great games are going to be made more and more by the same group of people working together on the same type of game with the same type of technology, tools, and workflow. If you look at Call of Duty 4, which everybody's super excited about, some of those same guys have been working on Call of Duty 1, Call of Duty 2, Call of Duty 3. There's a reason it's called Call of Duty 4. If you look at Halo, comes out tomorrow, right? Biggest game in the world. It's called Halo 3 for a reason. And even before Halo 1, 2, and 3, those guys worked on a brilliant game called Marathon, and they worked on an RTS, I can't remember what it was called. Myth. That same group of guys has been solving problems and fighting and learning to collaborate, in some cases, for how long is that? I mean, is that 10 years? They say that to achieve expertise in anything, you have to do the same thing for 10 years straight. So collaboration is just like hugely important, and that's the hardest thing about games, I think.
You just answered my second of 3 questions, so I don't have to ask it now. And then just to wrap up my part of this, unless these guys have no questions, which seems almost impossible to imagine. Everybody here in the class had to do their 5 favorite games.
Right.
I did my 10 favorite because I can't just do 5. Name your 5 favorite games and tell us why. Or as many as you can think about.
Yeah, briefly, I think this will date me in some ways. But my 5 favorite games are Doom. I think there's the purity of Doom. And really, if you wanted to get nitpicky, it's probably Doom 2 because it's the same game but better. But I always cite Doom. I mean, Doom is like such a pure, visceral experience. And I think we take it for granted now because lots of people have mastered that sort of game. But when Doom came out, there was nothing like it. You know, I mean, it was so adrenaline-based and so simple and pure, and that probably the best use of audio by that, and which is very important to me. I think audio is a huge part of the experience. And just so immersive and so fast-paced, so scary. So I love Doom.
I'm thinking about how much of that audio I heard through the wall separating my office from yours at Origin, actually.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oof.
People stayed late to play video games.
Lot of Doom.
Yeah. And then I would say probably XCOM is another one. And I don't know why, but it just came at the right time. It has a terrible interface. It has all these problems. It has these economics problems inherent in the game design. But there's just something magical about it, like where once you get into it and you master the interface, you can just play and play and play, and it's so awesome. And it's an example of like customizable, randomly generated content that players can then imbue with their own emotional content. So like, great example from XCOM, you bought new squad mates for your missions. So you're like, I need 15 soldiers, and 4 of mine died, so I need 4 replacement soldiers by tomorrow. I'm willing to pay $10K for each of them, bring them in. My new mission, I go out on the mission, it randomly generates the soldiers. There's like, you know, all kinds of ethnic variations. There's all kinds of hairstyles. There's male, female. It just randomly puts all those together, and then it randomly picks from a list of names. First names, last names, long list. It just randomly combines them. And so you go out on a mission, you've got, you know, 11 veterans and your 4 new guys, and every mission they all get better, and they also have inherent traits. Like some people get better at some things faster than other people by some stats that you don't actually see. It's a brilliant game. And I remember playing it and getting my squad into this situation where it was very dire. Most likely somebody was going to die in this situation because somebody was crouched next to a gas pump, which wasn't very smart, and there were 3 aliens hidden over here, and you know, and randomly the game had generated 2 squad mates who had the same last name, and one was male, one was female. And as I played a few missions, I just kind of started to think that they were husband and wife, you know, and that they had signed on to be these XCOM soldiers together. It's just ridiculous, ridiculous fantasy. And but when one of them died in the mission, I could not move on. Like a lot of times in XCOM, when your guys die, you just move on to the next mission and you order new troops. I couldn't do it. I kept playing the mission over and over so that both of them got out alive, because it just broke my freaking heart to think about one of them in a body bag and the other one flying back, you know. And so super simple fiction for the game, largely imparted by the user. Like there was no text saying they were husband and wife or whatever. It was largely like provided by me. It was me interpreting the game, and that's why it was interactive in that sense, you know, narratively. And so XCOM, Doom, Underworld certainly changed my life. What else? What have I really loved? You know, there are a lot of modern examples where I look at games like tracks or genres. So you could look at like Underworld, System Shock, BioShock, Stalker, all as the same game actually. You know, people just iterating on that design. And so I would probably fall back to the cheesy answer of meta games. So like that, the immersive sim is one of my favorite games. The fast-paced shooter like Doom is one of my favorite. And then I could call out examples in every one of those. Squad, turn-based strategy, XCOM or Jagged Alliance. You know, System Shock is probably up there. But that was probably, it's hard for me to separate the experience of being associated, you know, learning from the team and all that, you know. I have quirky little favorites that weren't very popular here and there. Like there was a game called Sacrifice that I thought was really cool that was a total failure.
Used to talk about that a lot.
Commercially. I feel like I learned a lot.
Was another one you used to
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to come up with a list, actually.
Well, let's not stress about it. Let's ask
Okay.
them, have some other questions that are maybe a little easier
Okay.
to tackle after talking for 2.5 hours. Whoa, everybody wake up. Okay. Yeah. Is there a, repeat the question.
Yeah, there's a demo for Blacksite. You can go to Xbox Live and download a demo that is actually really old code and content. I mean, we released it months ago, and it was from the snapshot of our engine from like December before or something. So a lot of stuff matured after that. And we hope to release a second demo soon. And the first demo was more just like aimed at, here's what the experience is. Delta Force operating in small town with breakables, and I don't even think the squad morale was working at that point, or it wasn't evident. The new demo is going to be aimed more at like, it's going to be twofold. It's going to have some really intense combat stuff outside a courthouse. I mean, again, this is how subversive our game is, like under the, I mean, it's not overt, but like, here's the setup, you tell me. You are American Delta Force guys fighting in American small town against an insurgency that was created by Black Ops programs in the United States from wounded KIA soldiers. And you're fighting outside a courthouse in a mission called Just a Piece of Paper under a giant banner that ironically says Veterans Day Memorial Rally. And so that's the kind of missions that I doubt Joe Walmart will notice that. But you know, you guys are like in a degree program aimed at interactive entertainment, so hopefully you'll notice that. But and so yeah, and then part of it is going to be a rail shooter. Actually, we did 2 rail shooters, which normally wouldn't be appealing to me at all. But we said, hey, if we're going to do 2 rail shooters to alternate up the gameplay, let's do the best rail shooters anybody's ever seen. And I think our rail shooters are really good. You know, I think they're certainly best of breed. So. But yeah, you can just go on Xbox Live and grab it. And the new demo, by the way, will be PC, PS3, and Xbox Live as well. So
how did you get such a subversive game? Like, how did you get that made? And how did you get your team to, like, you know, jump on this, you know?
yeah, that's a good question because it spins off into a bunch of other questions. I mean, like, if marketing at Midway had known any degree of this, I don't think they would have paid for it, basically.
They do now.
Yeah. And we've subsequently educated them and talked to them about what, you know, and to their credit, they've been like, well, okay, make sure you don't have to have one particular political view to play your game. Well, of course not. There are characters in the game with other views. And again, it's largely falls back to the things that I think most of us can agree on, you know. Torture is not good, you know. And if you disagree, if you think that governments torturing human beings for whatever reason, then I just disagree with you so much I don't care if you like my game or not, you know. And so, you know, we've gone back and forth, and I made sure that, you know who James Whale is, the guy that made Frankenstein in the 20s or 30s? 30s.
Waterloo Bridge.
You know, people point to him and they say that he was operating on multiple levels, even though he's dealing with some B-grade schlocky material. Like he's dealing with this giant, you know, monster back from the grave. But at another level, he was dealing with a story of alienation. And the movie Gods and Monsters, it kind of touches on that, you know. But in that way, you know, we wanted to make a game that if you just don't care about the politics, you just like shooters, and you just want to run around in American streets, that's kind of an innovation, actually, to shoot up bathrooms and rest areas on the side of the highway and convenience stores and be in the middle of a rainstorm in the middle of the night under a traffic light, next to a courthouse or whatever. If you just want to run through and shoot things, you can. On the other hand, if you want to appreciate our views, whether you disagree with them or not, you can do that as well. So I think the game operates at 2 levels, and I don't think everybody knew what we were going to do. Like, a lot of these elements came on very late, and so very often your marketing department will just look at it, and that's good, because if they don't notice it in a cursory overview, it also won't turn off the average gamer who doesn't care about this sort of thing anyway, right? And there are some of them who have looked at it, gone a little deeper, and gone, oh, this is kind of interesting. And in the same way that some players will also look at it and go, hey, this is kind of interesting. The second thing you asked that I think is more interesting is how do you get a team on board with this sort of thing? And like, as a person who's part producer, part creative director, I deal with this kind of thing a lot, and I also constantly find myself apologizing, which I'm trying to break myself of. Like, at the end of the day, I'm the creative director for this game. You are paying me to impart some of my vision into this game. That's why you want me here. Like, otherwise you're going to end up with something totally vague, totally derivative, or confused, right? We are at the point where games are a big enough budget and they're complex enough thematically and in terms of narrative that the pieces have to work together. I work with a very smart, strong-willed audio director, design director, art director. Our lead engineer he's got so many balls in the air that he doesn't pay attention to this part as much till the end of the game, I think, But the creative elements certainly, or the traditionally creative, what is traditionally seen as creative elements, those pieces have to play together. They have to resonate, I mean, we had that scene in front of the courthouse, and we planned it out. We laid out the level design. This guy, Brian Hess, who's worked on a bunch of different shooters, he set it up. Ricardo Bear went back through and changed it up. Ricardo and I had multiple meetings about how to make the combat better. We did all of that. Pete Franco, our art director, lit it. It looks like a small American town. The programmers helped us fit into the texture budget. It used to look better. Now it looks a little worse, but now it runs on the Xbox. And all the elements were there except there was no mission name, and the banner said Italian Pride Day or something. And I was like, I've got this list in the back of my head in my inbox where I'm eventually going to name all the missions, and no one on the team knows this yet. And a couple of designers were into the idea, and they helped me come up with the list. And I said, I bet if we apply just a piece of paper to the courthouse mission, that'll like resonate if you're actually paying attention to that. And then I look down one day and I'm like, Italian Pride Day in Rachel? Come on. Not only do I not buy that, but also that's an opportunity cost. That's an opportunity to set this whole thing off ironically by using Veterans Day Memorial Rally, whatever it says. It says something to that effect. And so by a couple of tweaks, the person who's doing creative direction, you don't have to be doing everything, but you want somebody on your team watching holistically the creative elements so that you're actually moving them in a direction, so that they're not just like the will of 60 people going random, And so I guess the answer to the question is not everybody on the team buys into it. Some of the people are devoutly conservative and they don't like my viewpoint, and they're still good friends and I still respect the hell out of them and we work well together. But I've had to say, like, we are making political satire, and we're going to have some characters in the game that represent the other views, but, here's the vision for the game, and I would never do anything so against everyone's views that it turned off the whole team or whatever. I do have the support of the bulk of the team, I think, even if they disagree, some of them.
Any questions?
You mentioned at some point that that this wasn't probably like the most polished game you had. Like, what would you change differently? And is it due to like lack of time, or is it because of like certain like design restrictions like early on, like sort of preventing?
It's a combination of things. Like, if I had more time, I'd go through the campaign, the story missions. We have 32 encounters, and I would pick the 5 clunkiest, and I would try to make them better. That's what I would do. because I know some of them are A caliber, some of them are B caliber, some of them are C caliber. Almost every game is like that, right? And our art director would feel the same way. He has not had time to light every single thing with as much attention. Some of the things are very well lit, some are okay, you know, and the whole game is almost a combination of that, right? Really well lit areas and passable. And so we'd probably pick the 5 most screwed up spots and try to make them a more interesting encounter. You know, if we had more time, I'd try to deepen the squad interaction and make the morale system more clear to the player. I think most players are going to totally ignore morale, and that's fine. I think some will be into it. It basically becomes like a weapon. You know, if you do the 5 right things in every battle, your squad gets more powerful, so the game gets easier for you. But if you ignore it, you can run and gun through the mission, and you'll be just fine. So I'd probably like pick the 5, you know, weakest areas and try to make them better. I'd probably deepen squad in some way. And then I would probably take our 2-player co-op. You can play with a buddy through the game, and I'd probably like, we had to triage that some, so you don't do the rail shooters together in co-op. You don't the cinematics. You don't go through the cinematics together. You know, it's just playing the missions, the combat missions. So I might tweak some of that out, and it's a combination of what the technology does really well. Like, we're using Unreal for better or worse. It's brilliant in some ways and has restrictions, like every piece of technology. Some of it is time. Like, we're approaching the video game's biggest Christmas ever. If our game is 4th ranked, it will sell wildly better during Christmas than if we polish the hell out of it and it was 2nd ranked 6 months from now. It will sell way better. And so that's not my call. That's like a business call. But I support those people making their decisions as validly as, you know, I need to make mine, right? They're trying to keep the business going. They're trying to fund my next game. So like, and I'm taking $20 million of their money. It's not really $20 million, but it's something like that, right? And so, you know, it's a whole series of things. It's like team stamina. Like, we've been working until 4 in the morning for like months now. And people are coming to me now, even my most loyal, like hardworking captains on the team are coming to me going, dude, I don't know how long I can do this. My wife is getting freaked out. My kids, they think I've gone away. They think I've moved or something. Like, you know, one of the guys has triplets, you know. A couple people have just had babies. Like, you know, people are starting to snap at each other. You know, it happens on every team. So it's just so many things, right? It's like, with the tool set we have, what would 3 months fix? Like, I could name probably 5 or 6 things. 6 months would fix even more. And I would love to like spend another year working on this game, making it just like the perfect version of what it is. But that would cost a lot more money, and we've already spent largely our marketing budget, so the return on investment wouldn't be very high. So as a creative guy, it pains me. As a person who wants to keep working and take another shot next time, try to execute better next time, like take the lessons from this one and apply them next time, like it makes a lot of sense, right? So, and you know, for what it's worth, I have no idea how good the game is or not. It looks beautiful. It's certainly the best looking and most audio polished game I've worked on, I think. But I'm too close to it. You know, we bring in random people off the street, and hardcore gamers are like, well, I'd rather play BioShock, or I'm going to wait for Call of Duty 4. But I like it. I like what you've done here and here. Random people that aren't super hardcore, who are what we were aiming for, the guys who buy 2 games a year or whatever, they seem to love it. They're laughing at the dialogue, and they're having a good time. It's not too hard for them. It's beautiful. And so I can't see it at all. When we finished Deus Ex, I thought it was a disaster. Like, I was like, oh my God, what have we done? We're ruined, you know.
I was beating my head on my, I was literally, there was one day I literally banged my head
we were terrified.
on the desk going, you know, I have no idea. I mean, if people get that we're giving them the opportunity to fight, sneak, or talk,
yeah,
we win. If they say your combat model isn't as good as Half-Life, your role-playing elements aren't as good as whatever BioWare had just shipped,
right,
you know, your stealth isn't as good as Thief. If people went that way, our careers were over.
Yeah.
You know?
And
we had no idea which way it was going to go.
And what he said is totally true. Like, we didn't do any single thing as well as a best-of-breed game in that genre. We just did 4 or 5 things and let you choose between them, you know? And our game ran at some spots on the target machine.
Don't say this out loud.
It ran at like 5 frames a second.
Dude, I can't believe you just
and
said
it, you know, and it's like, really your goal ought to be 60.
Yeah.
You know, Call of Duty 2, one of the best shooters ever, ran at 60 frames a second. The new Call of Duty doesn't, I don't think.
Thank you for coming, Harvey. No. Sorry.
And I think Blacksite, we made it a goal that every encounter needs to run at 30 frames a second. Because when we released the first demo, that's the feedback we got. It's like, hey, the game drops to 15 frames a second sometimes. That doesn't feel too good. It starts to like shudder, you know. And so we've made a big effort at making, I think we probably hit our goal 95% of the time, but like the game runs at 30 frames a second. I wish it ran at 60. But I couldn't believe, like I thought I liked I like parts of Deus Ex, but I thought that you know, the shooter mechanics were problematic and the game ran too slow and our AI was busted at times and it wasn't as pretty as a lot of the games, you know.
That's for
So
sure.
yeah, so I have no idea, but those are just some of the things off the top of my head that I would fix if somebody came down and gave me, you know, lots more money and I had more time to fix things.
But you know, there's a saying among writers that no story is ever completed; they're just abandoned.
Yeah.
You know, that's true for games times 10.
You know, you can work yourself into a trap of being perfectionist. Like one of my friends has literally been working on the same game for 9 years, and I don't know if he's ever going to ship it because it's like now the expectations are so high that
Sounds like forever.
yeah, exactly.
Perhaps on that note, we should end. So thanks for coming.
Did anybody have like one last quick
One?
question
Oh,
that
he's
that
got
they
more
didn't get
stamina
to,
than most
that they didn't get to ask? Oh, good. We hit everybody. So,
Okay.
Awesome.